Someone in my family is not human, and they haven't been since our trip to the family cabin. The four of us had always stayed at the cabin every year in the fall. We spent the initial cooling of autumn by the warmth of a cabin fire, as if to prepare ourselves for an even harsher winter. My father, mother, little brother Chris, and I enjoyed this tradition, and that moment every year when we would first see a leaf change color and fall to the ground, our excitement grew. Our yearly retreat meant sledding, snowball fights, hot chocolate, and that nostalgic scent of pine wood that made up the walls of the structure. We would spend a week there in those snowy mountains, close, bonding, happy. Dad would tell ghost stories and cliched urban legends every evening, and Mom would cook a feast of a country breakfast in the mornings. It was a pine-scented, bacon-flavored heaven. Until that particular nightfall fell, and a horrid noise erupted from the mountains around us. You could call it a howl, but it was unlike any howl I'd ever heard. Nature documentaries, horror films, real life. There was no equivalent to this sound. It seemed to reverberate forever off the slopes. It was loud enough to have our family in fear of an avalanche. But it wasn't a tempest sheet of ice and snow that shook us to our core. There was no avalanche. Rather, the sound of this howl seemed to affect my younger brother. After some time, I noticed he hadn't blinked for several minutes. His eyes watered, tears dripping down his cheeks, and yet he denied his body the satisfaction of blinking. I tried to get his attention, but the moment I spoke his name, he burst from his position on the rug, running out the door. My mother called after him. My father pursued, and in a panic, I found myself on my father's heels. Yet the old man was too fast for me. Moments after we entered the tree line running after my little brother, I'd lost sight of them both. The mess of footprints, animal prints, and various other disturbances in the snow left me with no idea where either of them had gone. My head shot back and forth in every direction, desperate for a clue. Knowing I couldn't just sit there, I ran forward, hoping that one of these sets of tracks would lead me to a familiar face. My cheeks and eyelids burned from the cold and wind that brushed past them. The snow came down harder, causing my teary-eyed vision to become even more dodgy. And then it happened. I hadn't expected to break through a tree line. I hadn't expected to fall down a sharp slope. After that, hitting my head upon a low-hanging branch and blacking out was no surprise at all. When I came to, it was still dark, still night. I looked around and quickly spotted the tree I had assaulted with my head. But now it was a couple of dozen yards away. Looking around me, I found myself further up the slope than when I'd blacked out, with a trail leading from the tree to where I lay now. As if I'd been dragged. Assuming it was my father who, for one odd reason or another, could not accomplish the task of carrying me back to the cabin, I called out his name. I didn't care for any avalanches. I belted my voice across those mountains and prayed my father would find me. There was a response, but it wasn't my father. There was a chilling scream coming from further up. It sounded like my mother. I picked myself up out of the much thicker snow. I lurched up the slope. I managed to find my way back, having memorized the direction of the scream. Sure enough, it had come from our cabin. Emerging from the tree line, I saw the cabin door wide open. It must have been that way for some time, as a thick layer of snow had found purchase on the hardwood floor inside. I took off in a haphazard sprint, meandering my way to the door through the snow. When I set foot on the wood surface, it felt as if I was on another planet. Stable footing was something I didn't know I could miss. "Mom?" I called out as I walked through the doorway. I pushed as much of the snow back outside as I could, and then I shut the door. I glanced around the room. The ember within the fireplace was dwindling, and my mother was nowhere to be seen. She had been sitting at the chair across the room from the fireplace, enjoying a toasty mug of dark roast coffee. With a sniff, I could very well still smell her distinct coffee, even in spite of my runny and stuffy nose. My boots slid, nearly causing me to fall, as I ran to the kitchen. Before I passed through the archway, a figure taller than myself emerged from around the corner. "Mom?" I whimpered. The fire crackled, and thin, dancing strips of light bounced from the form's face. It looked like my mother, but she was frowning and seemed to be staring past me. "Gloria, Chris is hurt." That voice was my father's. I turned on my heel to see him doggedly carrying my little brother in his arms. The small boy's face was tinged red and his breathing shallow. Struggling with what to say or do, I heard my mother finally speak. "Everyone in the car," she demanded. I obeyed without question or hesitation. The four of us piled into that 1999 Range Rover and hauled tail to the nearest hospital or doctor that could see us. To this day, Chris has a small scar on his cheek where he'd gotten frostbite. He doesn't seem to remember a bit of that night, doesn't even recall the mint chocolate cocoa we'd shared by the fire before he sprinted off into that near blizzard. Dad said he'd searched for Chris for several hours. He'd found my brother under the snow, and what bothers me was the way Dad said it appeared Chris had been buried, not simply covered by falling snow. Even now, my dad is adamant that there were dozens of other prints around the mound in which Chris had been buried. As for me, when I woke up from blacking out after hitting that tree branch, I'd apparently awakened near morning, though it was still quite dark out. The doctor said I was quite lucky that I didn't get frostbite too, though I did get a nasty concussion. But that didn't weigh on my mind. Instead, I couldn't keep myself from wondering what had dragged me up the slope. Because Dad said he never saw me. He even apologized, saying that he didn't know I took off after him once Chris left the cabin. And regarding my mother, she always behaved strangely when talking about the event. She says when the three of us ran out of the cabin, she closed the door and had an emergency number dialed on her phone ready to call for help at a moment's notice as she watched out the window. But that just doesn't match up. And the way she looked at me when I came back to the cabin. Well, as the months went on after returning home, things slowly felt normal again. We all seemed to forget the panic of that night, realigning ourselves with our daily routines and habits. Before long, I stopped noticing Chris's scar. I stopped pestering my mother about her recollection of events. I stopped harassing my father about exactly what he saw out there. It's funny how going back to school, spending the night at friends' houses, and enjoying the newest video games can make it seem as if a traumatic event never happened. Or maybe I simply didn't want to think about it anymore. A few months after the cabin excursion, I awoke one night to my eyes watering and my nose wrinkled. There hung a sour smell in the air, working thoughts of spoiled milk or sun-worn cheese in my mind. It was the first time in my life a smell had been vile enough to stir me from slumber. I gagged when I tried to yawn. Throwing the sheets off of me, I groggily crept from my bed in search of the smell. One messy plop underfoot later, I realized the source of the smell lay right at the foot of my bed, right where I had just stepped. Lifting my foot and wincing at the wretched sensation of unknown sludge and mucus stuck to my heel, I stared down at the rug. A pile the color of pitch-dark blue, with tinges of peachy flesh-tinted clots, sat as a splatter on the floor. There was so much of it. Horrified, I screamed, awaking my brother who shared the room with me and causing my father to come running down the hallway. "What's the matter?" he asked hurriedly after throwing open the door. I don't know what this stuff is, and it's everywhere." I tried to maintain composure in my explanation. My dad approached where I was standing. He squinted his eyes and flinched when the smell really hit him. What did you do?" he demanded to know, still staring at the refuse while pinching his nose. I didn't do anything. How could I even make something?" I pointed at the revolting mess. "Like this." My father raised an eyebrow, looking to me then back at the sludge-like mass. He walked over and knelt down, examining the substance. I thought he was going to touch it for a second, but then I saw him grimace. A few extended moments later, he said, Just clean it up, the both of you." I rolled my eyes, still ready to vomit or scream, depending on what the sludge decided to do if I touched it. Chris went straight for the bottle of Febreze we kept in the bathroom. A minute after Dad had left the room, he came back. "Hey, did your mother pass by here?" I shook my head. His brow furrowed. I listened to him walk down the hallway toward the living room, calling her name, but not getting a response. After cleaning up the mess, Chris and I helped look for her, but she was nowhere in or around the house. She wasn't answering her phone either. After hours of searching, we all slept in Dad's bed, hoping she would return soon. In the morning, I woke up next to Dad, who seemed to be unblinkingly staring at the opposite end of the bed. Slowly, I looked over past Chris's still sleeping form, and there was my mother, smiling at us as if she had just awakened from a peaceful night's rest. "Good morning," she bid us. My father woke Chris and forced the two of us out of their room. We then heard our parents arguing for the next 10 minutes, after which my mother stormed out of their room and sat patiently at the kitchen table while her coffee brewed from our Keurig. The smell of dark roast coffee hung in the air. I cringed at it, reminded of the cabin. That was all it took before I looked at her like I looked at her then, with suspicion and fear. Once the sound of coffee spurting from the dispenser ceased, Mom walked over, then returned with her steaming beverage. She stared off into the distance, which wasn't more than a tall kitchen window with white blinds. That was the face of my mother, deeply concerned. It was then I happened to find focus on her fingernails. There was something there to see, and my eyes wouldn't pry away from them, even though I didn't understand why for a few seconds. Then, mouth agape, I knew. The same pitch-dark blue substance, it was stuck underneath each one of her fingernails. There were even traces of the flesh-colored clots. Feeling a need to ascertain what I'd noticed, I ran up to her and forced my arms around her. A hug that I wanted to recoil from, but I was close enough then to smell her hand. Coffee grounds, earth, curdled milk, and putrid cheese. "Oh, sweetie, Mom and Dad are gonna be okay." She rubbed my forearm, those dirty nails sliding across my skin. "It's just, I'm going through a hard time right now, okay?" I released my hold on her and stepped back. She was crying. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at me. No, through me, once again. I hated it. Something about the way she now looked at me I despised. It made me nauseous and angry all at once. My mother, ever since that night at the cabin, hadn't once looked at me normally. Hadn't once treated me as she had used to. That was the beginning of the changing of my mind. This person drinking my mother's coffee, wearing my mother's bathrobe, and sitting at my mother's chair, it wasn't my mother at all. From then on, I kept a safe distance from her, but I always made sure I was close enough to observe her. Sometimes I would watch her when she didn't know I was there. I was invigorated to rediscover her daily routine. Was it the same? If she looked at her own son so differently anymore, then surely the small, more mundane aspects of her life had changed in kind. I watched her do the laundry through cracked door. I stared at her when she left for her morning runs. I pretended not to notice when she came back, glancing a little bit more than she knew. Yet it all seemed the same. Aside from the occasional discrepancies in her behavior, like the night with the mess in my room, my mother acted like she used to. Then I decided to test her in a different way. When she'd leave on her own, I'd ask to go with her. When she'd go for runs, I'd ask to join her. When she was bored and looking at her phone, I requested that she play a board game with me. Any decent parent would see this as a child longing for more attention from their parent. But it soon became clear to me that my mother didn't see it this way. She seemed hesitant when I asked to tag along, and when she would eventually give in, Mom would always have nothing to say or talk about. It was clear she didn't want me around her. This broke my heart even more. My mother and I had always been so close. She used to read the Boxcar Children book series to me in bed. She always made sure I got dibs on the mixing bowl when she was making brownies or cookies. And when my first girlfriend broke up with me, my mother held me and cried with me. That had been my mother. Whoever or whatever this person was, it was no longer her. One night, I awoke in a cold sweat. Something felt wrong. I felt hot and cold, achy yet numb, and I had a bad taste in my mouth. I sat up in my bed and wiped my tired eyes. When I opened them again, I nearly screamed. A tall, dark figure stood at the edge of my bed. Feminine, familiar, my mother. She was holding something in her right hand, but it was too dark for me to be sure of what it was. "Mom?" I called to her in an exhausted voice. She did not voice a reply. Instead, she shook her head. Seconds later, I could see a glimmer in her eyes. tears? She stepped forward, beginning to approach my side of the bed, her right hand rising into the air with that unknown object grasped tightly. I tried to crawl away, but my back hit only wall. Then she began to swing. Instinctively, I closed my eyes and covered my face with my hands, palm out. In that moment, I can't be sure if I felt anything at all, but I do know my heart pounded with denial. "Honey, what are you—" My father entered the room and turned on the light. Revealed was my mother, standing over me, a knife in her hand. There was blood on my blankets, blood on my hands, and that repugnant odor had once again returned. I looked her right in the eyes. There seemed to be nothing human left in them. My father leapt and stole the knife from her grasp, shouting expletives. When the knife fell, hitting the hardwood floor with a metallic clang, she took off from my room. I heard her exit the house. My dad began to dial 911, but I grabbed him by the arm. "Please don't. Not Mama," I pleaded. He looked at me. Then he turned toward my brother, who was cowering wide awake in the corner. My father, gritting his teeth, locked his phone. He took the two of us to his room and began to explain that our mother just wasn't well. She needed help, he said, but even he didn't seem to understand what was wrong with her or why. My heart ached. I was breathless the remainder of the night. How could she have done this? Even if my paranoid thoughts about her were now solidified, I still could not believe it. My own mother had tried to kill me. Dad called my grandma on Mom's side, letting her know which direction she took off in and that it might be best to find her sooner rather than later. I didn't sleep that night, opting to wander the halls, looking out the windows of our quiet home and afraid I'd see my own mother through them. I went to the front door, making sure it was locked. Then I checked the back. While the back door was closed, I noticed it was unlocked. As I reached for the bolt, I paused. There was a dark red stain on the floor leading underneath the door. Swallowing hard, I opened the back door and I peered outside. Thankfully, my mother wasn't there, but something else was, something that smelled of rot and soil. Looking down, my eyes saw it lying on the mat, an amputated, dirt-covered human leg. I wanted to vomit. I cried into my hands that my father had quickly bandaged. Though I didn't know who my mother was anymore, I took the leg and I hid it in a hole in the backyard. I still loved my mother, and I didn't want to see her in trouble. I went back to bed, and I tried to forget the entire night. For weeks, we didn't hear from my mom, until Dad finally got a call from Grandma stating that she was okay and being looked closely after at their place. My dad was quick to caution them, reminding them that having attacked her own son, there was no telling what she might do. Soon after, my mom began calling us herself. At first, Dad wouldn't even pick up the phone, but missing her, it didn't take long for him to relent. She begged him to come over to her parents' house so they could talk this through. He refused a dozen times before finally agreeing to see her. I couldn't blame the man. He loved my mom and had always been crazy about her. When the day came that he would talk with her, he pulled me aside and asked me to watch Chris here at the house. I complied with a nod, but what he didn't know was that I'd already told Chris that I'd be going with him. When he wasn't looking, I hid myself in the back of the vehicle just as he was about to leave. Half an hour later, the incessant bumps in the road I felt told me we were pulling into a gravel driveway. We were at Grandma and Grandpa's house. Dad exited the car and closed the door. I heard him speaking with my grandparents outside before they let him in. When I was sure no one remained outside, I crept from the back of the vehicle and made my way to the side of the house. I'd spent the night here many times before. I knew they had only 2 bedrooms, one a master bedroom and the other a guest room. If my mother needed a place of privacy to talk with my dad, it would certainly be in the guest room she'd be staying in. Staying close to the wall, I rounded the house. I crouched below the guest bedroom window, and I placed my ear to the wall. The house was old. That was to my advantage. I could hear nearly perfectly through the wooden planks.
"I didn't attack our son."
My mother sounded exasperated.
"I saw you in the kid's room holding a knife."
My dad shouted back.
"Did you see him?"
"My son, bloodied from his own mother trying to cut him up? Of course I did."
"Henry, I didn't touch him with that knife. That blood wasn't his. Did you not check him for cuts?"
"Gloria, there was so much blood. I bandaged him up as quickly as I could and prayed he wouldn't need a doctor. A doctor would need answers, and the kids begged me not to call the authorities on you. I couldn't risk it."
"No, Henry, there were no cuts on him. Have you not seen how strangely he's been acting?"
"What? Are you trying to blame him for this?"
"He's always watching, always listening. He's been following me everywhere I go, and then I saw that leg at the back door and—"
"Leg? What?"
"That night, I found a severed human leg at the back door. Didn't you hear the news the next day? About the missing kid in our neighborhood?"
"No,
Henry, our son did that."
I listened unblinkingly, staring down at my bandaged hands. I began to unwrap them. Layer by layer, I could see my skin. Dried blood. No cuts. No bruises, no slices, nothing. The blood wasn't mine. My hands were perfectly clean, unscarred. My mother continued.
"Look, I don't want to say it outright. Not yet. So I'll just start where it began. You remember what happened at the cabin, don't you? The weird howl in the mountains, little Chris running out the door in the snow. Well, Ben chased after you. Ben kept asking my account of what happened that night, but I always told him a lie. I didn't want him to know what I knew. You see, I chased after Ben. I was afraid one of you would get lost out there, and I had to make sure you would all be okay. I followed Ben, but he managed to stumble down a slope. When I saw him hit that tree, I was horrified, and I started to rush towards him, but then I saw something. I don't know what it was, but it crawled through the snow on all fours, and its limbs were so thin. It couldn't have been human. It grabbed Ben while he was unconscious and began to drag him up the mountain. I shouted at the thing. I couldn't let it take my son. But it turned its eyes on me and began to bound through the snow towards me. I ran back to the cabin. I figured there'd be something there I could defend myself with. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find and hid around the corner. The next thing I knew, the door slammed open. I didn't hear anything after that, save for another howl. Hours must have passed before I heard that door shut. I heard footsteps approaching the kitchen, and I rounded the corner. I saw Ben in front of me. I hid the knife behind me. I didn't want to scare him. I wanted to grab him and thank the heavens he was okay, but I stood there, frozen. Henry, Ben's eyes, They were solid black, and he was covered in this thick, dark substance. I couldn't bear to look right at him, but I looked long enough to see the black fade from his eyes and the substance absorb into his skin.
Gloria, this is too much for me. You're lying. What happened to you?
Nothing, Henry, but something happened to Ben. I left him out there. I didn't go back for him. That thing got him. That boy we brought home. That boy isn't ours. Think about it, Henry. He didn't have any damage from the cold like Chris did. The doctor said he had a concussion, but there was no sign of one at home. And that night when you three found that sludge in his room, I wasn't there that night because I'd been trying to dispose of the other half of it.
What?
Ben isn't human. That stuff, it comes from him. He changes. He follows a certain smell. I've seen the way he looks at us, the way he smells people and stares at them. When I watched him change again, I stayed up waiting for him to come home. Well, last time he came home with that human leg in his mouth. That's why I had a knife, Henry. Please, you have to believe me.
I hadn't realized that I'd slumped over onto the ground. I was still staring at my hands. She had to be lying, right? I thought to myself. I'm still me. I'm the same me that I remember. I tried to reason with everything she had confessed, but everything was perfectly explained by what she said. The muck under her nails, the sludge at the foot of my bed, the way she suddenly started looking at me and treating me differently. And most of all, the blood on my hands that didn't come from me. My mother and father have since separated. My dad kept both of us, and my mother now lives with her parents. She calls almost every day, begging my dad to keep Chris safe from me. I can hear her over the phone with how loud she begs, but my father doesn't completely believe her. Or he does, and he's simply in denial. I've seen how he looks at me when he tells Chris and me goodnight. I've seen how he lingers at the door, staring right at me for a moment before leaving the door open and going to his own room down the hallway. I've seen how he cleans up my messes in the middle of the night by the bed, pretending it's normal, like it's the mess of some puppy that needs to be housebroken. And now every night, when I close my eyes to sleep, I look at my brother. He's still so young enough to sleep peacefully. At most, he's confused about everything that's happened, but he trusts us all as he always had. But I don't trust myself, because one day I'm afraid that the other me I change into will see how easy of a meal Chris might be. You've probably played games with procedurally generated levels. You've probably even heard some procedurally generated music playing in the background of your favorite films or video games. We've been on the precipice of an AI-generated world for some time now, but I think I've crossed the point of no return. I've got a master's in computer science, as well as a master's in artificial intelligence. Unfortunately, I was unable to employ this knowledge, as once I graduated, I had to start work in a massive office building as a call operator. Our job was to call leads, who were people who may or may not, mostly not, be interested in a product we helped third parties sell. It required no previous skill or education. It felt like a waste of my time, but I had to do it. Student loans sort of swallow your whole life like that, swallow your dreams away. Always working away your time to pay back the people who promise to help you get a real career. But that's life, I guess. I worked 44 hours a week, as we had an odd 4-hour Saturday every week. I was always exhausted, always denied my few friends' requests to hang out. I was in a terrible way. My life did not turn out how I wanted it to. It was after a night of binge drinking that I realized I had everything I needed to make my dreams real, even if I didn't get paid in the meantime. I could become an inventor of something never seen or done before. Computer procedurally generated data was something I did a thesis on. I'd always believed it would be our future. In some far-off year, you could walk up to a computer interface when you're hungry, and the computer would read what you crave most, coming up with something that possibly isn't even a known dish, but it matched your desires to the T. With artificial intelligence, anything is possible. A smart enough algorithm can become as creative, or more creative, than any person. So why did I settle on movies? Well, I'm a big fan of horror films. The best movie ever made, in my opinion, was John Carpenter's The Thing. So outwardly horrifying, yet infinitely rewatchable, as you try to figure out who becomes a monster before it's revealed. I think I must have seen it 100 times by the time I was 28. I kept thinking one night while sipping at a glass of whiskey, what if there was a software that took observations of your personality and created a 3D CGI movie that it knew you would enjoy? Wouldn't that be amazing? You get bored, you sit down at your computer, and you tell the software that you want to watch a movie. It sounded so good at the time. It sounded world-changing. And after 3 long years of secret development, it was ready to test. I had it installed on my desktop workstation, a computer that I'd invested $5,000 in over the past few years, so that it had all the power it needed for the software to work. I named my software Creation. Simple, maybe a bit edgy, but for the time it would work. With my glass of wine and a box of Cheez-Its of all things, I sat down one evening after work and I double-clicked the icon. The black, borderless window opened up perfectly. The word Creation was displayed at the top center discreetly. I had gone for a dark, minimal approach to it. It was time for me to make my first movie. Now, there were some problems, of course, with this limited software. After all, I could only do so much by myself, and with a very, very limited budget. For one, when the movies were done, they would have no voice acting. One thing that AI will have a very difficult time replicating in the future is a realistic human voice. Secondly, it took approximately 2.5 minutes for a single frame of a movie to render. So, with the typical 90-minute movie, filmed at a cinematic frame rate, it would take Creation around 7 to 8 months to complete. So I had to compromise with my first film. I was too eager, too excited to wait that long, just to see how a feature-length film could turn out. I decided on making the film 45 minutes instead, short enough that I could wait for it, but long enough to have a decent feel of a real movie. That way I would know if Creation made movies decently. But that would take about 4 months. But I reminded myself, with the last sip of wine, it would all be worth it in the end. I clicked the rounded rectangular button on the window that read Create, and an elapsed time window appeared. Approximate time to completion, 101 days. A bit shorter than I previously thought. Now you might be wondering how the software writes the film, and what the software bases that writing on? Well, I took the shady approach. I taught the AI to read the user's computer. Search history, documents containing text, chat logs, online gaming records. It would attain data on any normal person's personality and could accurately guess your favorite film at a 96% success rate, based on my own tests. And yeah, I even secretly installed the software on some coworkers' computers, allowing creation to read their data, and it would guess almost every one of them perfectly. I would later on ask that coworker what their favorite film was, and I would be astonished and quite proud when their answer matched creation's. Now all there was to do was wait, and waiting was the hardest part. I found myself growing more and more irritated as the months went by, often snapping at coworkers when they tried to chat with me. I think I nearly got myself written up once when I rolled my eyes at my boss. In the end, though, it would be worth it. I told myself that every morning. My worst fear was that the power would go out and completely reset creation's progress, but luck was in my favor. Or maybe it was misfortune. Creation finished rendering the movie 7 days early. I was ecstatic. I drew the blinds, turned out most of my lights to set the mood, and even popped some popcorn. I immersed myself in the movie-watching setting. Then I opened the AVI file in the VLC application. Before I knew it, the movie, my movie, was playing right before my eyes. To my amazement, creation had made herself her own opening credit, a minimal yet beautiful hand-drawn transition where an invisible hand drew each of the letters in creation. I audibly laughed. There were tears in my eyes. Just seeing what creation was capable of, it made me so incredibly confident in the movie yet to come. Soon, my own name flashed on the screen under the word "inspired by," and my giddiness grew. The black background then faded out, revealing a CGI wasteland. The detail of the textures was astounding. I felt then that every minute spent waiting for this film was worth it. Judging from the scenery and grunge lighting, I immediately assumed that creation had set out to make a thriller, suspense, or even a horror film, though I hadn't specified. But I'd have to wait and see to be sure. The camera jump cut to a close-up of the cracked, dried soil. Suddenly, red liquid spilled out over the soil, moistening it extremely realistically. Some of the liquid spilled into the cracks. I watched on the edge of my seat, unable to finish chewing the popcorn in my mouth. The camera slowly panned to the right, revealing a person's hands clawing at the ground. The red liquid continued to flow, and the camera panned until the source of the fluid was found. The person, a man, his throat was cut open in a deep gash, and an unending flow of red came pouring out. "Holy crap," I said. I smiled wide, my mouth open wide, and then the camera jumped to a close-up of what I assumed to be the man's eyes. My stomach sank a bit. There was something familiar about them. I swallowed, finally, and ignored it, continuing to watch the movie. The camera began to pull away, widening the view and revealing the man's face. My hands were trembling, even as they held onto the sides of my chair so hard the knuckles were white. "What?" I managed to say in a stammer. A perfect, hyper-realistic CGI rendering of my own face stared back at me from the screen. The man with the leaking wound was me, a 3D model of me, but it was so accurate that even the birthmark on the ridge of my nose was there. Struggling to breathe, I found myself fingering that birthmark, feeling for it as if I would find it stolen from my own face. It was still there, a perfect mirror of the mark on the CGI man's face. The man, who was apparently me, had a blank expression, even as he appeared to be on the verge of death. But when he began to smile, I jumped right out of my seat. "No, that's not even possible," I said. His front teeth, the incisors, they were slightly crooked on the right, exactly how mine were. How in the world would a software know what I looked like? How did it know my exact form down to my birthmark and the shape of my teeth? I did not have a webcam. I didn't have an actual camera in my house except the one on my cell phone. It was impossible. And I had never programmed creation to do something like that. I was panicking, heart pounding hard in my chest. I had to remind myself to breathe. But as I stared at the screen, I did not blink. The man suddenly stopped smiling as his mouth tore open at the sides. He screamed. Suddenly, his body began to destruct and change. Bones popped out of his skin, joints inverted. Teeth grew in places where there should never be teeth. His neck folded in on itself, forcing the skin tissue of the throat to tear at the strain. Underneath that neck skin, I was horrified to see another face. This one was far from human. I grabbed at my body as I watched my CGI self being torn asunder. My own joints and skin stung at the sight of myself being mangled. My stomach tightened, and I felt as if I might throw up. When his transformation was complete, the second face smiled like the first did before. Its teeth were razor sharp. There were rows upon rows of them. Then it spoke. I was petrified to hear my own voice coming from that creature. "I do hope you're enjoying the movie." Was it talking to me? Another impossibility. It couldn't be. At the very most, it was a pre-rendered scene that creation had placed in the film. But that would mean that creation knew it was making a movie, and it knew that I would be watching, and somehow it recreated my voice. Coming to my senses, I leapt at the desktop tower, clicking violently at the power button. Thankfully, the computer shut down just as it should, and soon I was left in my dimly lit room. My breathing was slow and shaky. My hands still trembled. I ended up spilling half the glass of water I had poured for myself as I tried to drink it. What had I created, and how had it gone so wrong? It made no sense. Creation rendered images that were too accurate. How had she gotten that information? I had never once admitted or took pictures of my birthmark or my teeth and stored them on my computer. And I didn't have social media. I used more anonymous services like Reddit and the occasional dive into 4chan. I tried to forget about it for the evening. I turned on all the lights in my apartment and tried to diffuse my horror with some cartoons. That night, I did not sleep easily. I had nightmare after nightmare, dreams of looking in the mirror and seeing that creature look back. Dreams of waking in the middle of the night to see another CGI version of me smiling from my closet. I woke up several hours early in the morning, and I stayed up. It took me a few days to calm down enough to turn my desktop back on. Everything seemed normal. It booted up fine. My desktop was as it should be, and all my shortcuts were there. Even creation. I began to sweat a bit at the sight of her, but I had to open it again. I had to know if what happened the first time was a fluke, or if it was something more. I messed with the settings a bit first, requesting creation to make a movie for me that matched certain parameters. Genre, comedy. Runtime, 4 minutes. Realism, low. It was the polar opposite of the first movie, which I had long since placed into the recycle bin and deleted forever. I was determined, confident that this time around nothing would go wrong. With these parameters, it absolutely couldn't. It would be impossible. As impossible as hearing my own voice and seeing my own face in a procedurally generated film. I shuddered. Then clicked Create. Approximate time to completion, 4 days. I waited. This time, severe anxiety enveloped me rather than excitement. What would creation show me this time? The work week flew by, even though I wished they wouldn't. Suddenly, it was Saturday, and I had nothing to do. The time remaining for creation to finish rendering read 2 hours. I passed the time reading random news feeds, but I couldn't concentrate on a single headline. The next time I looked at the monitor, the render bar had disappeared. The movie was done. I shut my eyes hard and breathed in deep. Then I sat in my desk chair and opened the file. Like before, creation had inserted the hand-drawn logo for herself with a black background. Then, as before, the black background began to fade away. I was starting to get jittery. The scene came into view. It was a top-down view of a guy sleeping in bed. He was in a funny position, with his hair a crazy mess and a snore that could wake the neighbors for miles. I was relieved. The first film really was just a fluke. His alarm then went off. He jumped up suddenly and turned to look at the alarm clock. Humorously, it read, late, then blinked and said, really late. I smiled. It had the comedic timing of a Pixar film. His mouth suddenly moved to express his panic. Of course, no actual voice came out. Creation could do sound effects like snoring and the music, but not voices. I was relaxing in my chair now. My muscles had stopped tensing up, and I was actually beginning to enjoy the short film. I was 3 minutes in, and the story unfolded. It was a simple story of a guy whose alarm clock had reset in a subtle power outage in the night. He kept imagining his apparently mean and loud boss being even more mean and loud than before. It was actually enjoyable. Until he arrived at work. My mouth slowly came open. That's my office building, I whispered to no one but myself. The name of the company was the same. The shape of the building was the same. The main character even parked in the same spot that I parked every weekday. No, I was begging, but my computer could not listen. The main character ran into work and quickly situated into his cubicle. A cubicle that not only sat in the same spot as my own, but it was also decorated the same. A picture of my recently deceased dog, one of those drinking bird toys, an ergonomic keyboard I had purchased at Best Buy that helped relieve stress from my wrists. Tears began to stream down my face, but I could not look away. The terror was an adhesive to my focus. When the main character sat down in his chair, he suddenly stood up, back stiffened, then slowly turned toward the camera. For the first time, he looked right at it. He was smiling. Suddenly, the video glitched. Artifacts and tears deranged the entire scene. Then the lights in my apartment began to flicker. I think I screamed, but I couldn't be sure. In my state of fear and insanity, I had clutched my head in my hands and pleaded for everything to stop. It was at that moment that I heard it. I do hope you're enjoying the movie. A whisper in my ear. A whisper in my own voice. When I turned to see my intruder, to see my own nightmare before me, I saw nothing. The lights stayed on, and the desktop computer had crashed when I turned back around. Everything was normal again. I've been sitting in my room for hours. I don't know what to do. I'm torn. On one hand, I've created something that could change the entire entertainment world. But on the other, there's something wrong with it. Something terrible. Something that makes me think letting people use this software could only mean the worst. I still have creation on my computer, but I don't know if I will open her again. My nightmares are more frequent than ever, and I'm starting to think the one about the closet is more real than I choose to believe. Come on, just stay awake. I slapped myself in the face a couple of times, trying my hardest to keep my eyes open, focusing on the road ahead. It was already difficult enough navigating the road without any streetlights. I'd been driving down this meandering wooded road for about 6 hours now, totaling an 8-hour drive alone in my car. To make matters worse, I'd been up for about 18 hours. That's what happens when you finally get to meet up with friends after months of being apart. And then you get a call in the middle of the night from your boss telling you that you actually have work in the morning. Despite telling him I was in a different state, he didn't care, and warned me that if I didn't show up in the morning, I would not have a job. In my defense, my schedule never showed I was supposed to work that day. Anyway, long story short, I was exhausted, and if I didn't find somewhere to stop and rest fast, I was going to wind up in a ditch or flattened against some tree. Luckily, just as my head was beginning to bob with the weight of sleep debt, I saw some lights coming up on my right in the distance, a brief opening in the forest. As I drew closer, I turned into the parking lot. There, sitting snugly in an opening of the ocean of trees I'd been driving through, was a motel. A nameless motel. There was no sign stating its name, but there was a big vacancy neon sign radiating at me irritatingly in a blue-green incandescent color. The way a couple of letters on the sign would randomly flicker made my eyes hurt. It was beginning to give me a headache. The lot was empty, so finding a parking space was easy. I quickly made my way to the front desk, my legs feeling as if they weighed 1,000 pounds each. I opened the door, causing some digital bell greeting to go off. But it sounded like the system was not connected to power very well, because it sounded like a children's toy with dying batteries. Yet another thing that was causing my sleep deprivation to physically ail me. I dragged myself up to the front desk, where a man I could only describe as odd was waiting for me. This man, who was about 6'3", so he was kind of a tall guy, was dressed in a blue dress shirt with a tie. He wore a smile that didn't budge an inch for the entirety of our back and forth, if you could call it that. The weirdest part about this guy was the way he stood. He was so stiff and straightened up, it appeared as if a slight breeze could break him in half. And after a few moments, I noticed that his left eye kept twitching every few seconds. Basically, the guy was giving off all the wrong kinds of vibes. But I ignored this. My sleep was far more important than my paranoia. Besides, being that tired possibly was making things seem more exaggerated than they really were. Could you give me a room, please? I don't care which," I requested. The man, without speaking to me or turning around to grab some key, pulled one out from under the desk and slapped it on the table. I immediately noticed that his fingernails were perfect. Everything about him was clean and organized, perfectly symmetrical. It was really throwing me off. There was something about the guy's face that seemed wrong, despite him being handsome. It was similar to the way you feel something's wrong when you see a picture of a person, when one half of their face is simply mirrored to the other half. You don't see it right away, but you know it's just odd. I pulled out my wallet, beginning to pull out a credit card. I placed it on the desk next to the keys, asking, "How much for a night?" But he didn't reply. He didn't blink or react to me putting a card on the counter. "How much for a night?" I spoke up, exhaustion making me impatient. Once more, he didn't reply or respond in any way. Staring at him, I slowly reached for the key, which was a key card. I placed it in my pocket and began to retract my other hand, which had my credit card in it. And then the man finally spoke, causing me to jump a little bit. "Pay when leave." "Okay," I replied. "I'll see you in the morning then, to pay up. Thank you, and good night." I practically shambled away from that front desk, a zombie, terrified and in a hurry. I looked at the keycard in my hand when I was back outside. A slight drizzle began to come down, so I stepped back under the awning. Looking back at my keycard, it read room 12. Alright then, I began to make my way under the awning towards my room. Apparently, he had assigned me the room at the very end of the building, closest to the woods, and the furthest away from the main desk. Nice. I'd have some privacy, I guess. At the room 12 door, I slid the keycard into the doorknob. There was no sound or beep or recognition of the card, so at first I wasn't sure if it even worked. But upon twisting the doorknob, the door opened with ease. "Huh," I grunted, and went inside. I turned on the lights via the light switch on the wall next to the door, and immediately saw that none of the light bulbs were brighter than a match, so until my eyes were able to adjust, I was nearly blind as I walked around and navigated the room. I made sure to lock the door behind me first, and I closed the curtains to the window of the room. Feeling around with hands and feet, I eventually made it to my bed, and as I practically jumped into the bed, I was surprised when it rippled underneath me and made waves. It was a waterbed. I hadn't seen a waterbed in decades. While it was a bit charming, it was definitely weird. Before I dozed off, I quickly remembered to set an alarm. If my calculations and positioning was right, then in the morning I'd be able to make it to work a bit early. But I would still have about 5 or 6 hours of a drive to get there. Thankfully, I had an afternoon shift. Everything all taken care of, I was soon in dreamland. I woke up with a start. I felt half dead when I raised up my head. Something was wrong. It was still too dark outside, according to what I could still see through the closed curtains. But something else was up. I looked over to my phone, which lit up on the side table. The alarm was going off. I cursed under my breath, realizing I'd mistyped the alarm time. I'd only gotten, an hour and a half of sleep? Great. Barely conscious at all, I attempted to raise my arm up to reach for my phone to fix my error. But as I did so, I realized my arm was submerged in fluids. In fact, everything below my shoulders was soaking wet. I shouted a curse this time as I wrangled myself out of the bed. Despite my eyes being closed for over an hour, my vision still hadn't adapted enough to see anything in the room, really. Nothing except silhouettes. I was able to pull myself from the bed, which had apparently busted and submerged me, partially, in the water of the waterbed. I stood on the cheap carpet of the motel room, staring at the silhouette of the busted bed. I was irate, but a little glad that I hadn't paid for this awful room just yet. I then thought to myself, I didn't know waterbeds were so deep. If I'd sank any further, I could have drowned in my sleep. I threw my clothes back on and stepped outside, all the while fixing and double-checking my alarm time on my phone to make sure this didn't happen again. Then I stormed back over to the opposite side of the building, to the front desk. When I threw open the door, the digital greeting bell rang again, sounding even more lo-fi than before. I walked right up to the desk, but the man was gone. "Hello? Anybody here?" I called out, trying not to sound too angry, but I think it came out that way anyway. I mean, I was still soaking wet, so it was hard not to be mad. And my skin was burning too. I've always wondered what they put in waterbeds. I thought to myself it must be something more than water, maybe some kind of chemical. No one showed up for about a minute or so. I searched the desk with my eyes, trying to find some sort of bell I could ring, something to get the clerk's assistance. Suddenly, the lights in the building began to flicker. They went out for a few seconds, and I heard a strange noise. I saw a silhouette behind the front counter sort of uncurl from the floor until it was at full height, perfectly stiff and straight. The lights flickered back on, and there was the man, as symmetrical and clean as before, donning the same smile. Had he been sleeping in the floor behind the counter this whole time? I tried to peer over to see if there was some sort of bed or cot back there, but I didn't see anything but carpet, drawers, and wall. I shook my head and refocused my attention. "Look, the waterbed in my room busted. Could I get a different room or something? I'm exhausted. I really don't want to start a problem or anything, I just want to sleep." With a quick slap, there was another key card in front of me, lying there on the counter. This one read 11, the room right next to mine. I grabbed the key card with a sigh. I looked at the man, and I said, "Thank you." Then I began to walk out of the room, when I realized the key card I'd gotten from the counter just now was warm and a little slippery. Once outside, I looked at the key card more closely. It was wet, but perhaps that was from me being wet. I was too tired to give much more than a damn. I made my way to room 11, slid the key card in, and I walked inside. I flicked on the light switch, and once more the lights barely worked. It was more the semblance of working lights than actual working lights at all. I was beginning to get frustrated. But what else did I expect from this motel? Of course, this room was no different than the last. I simply hoped the bed would sustain itself this time. Instead of jumping into the bed, I cautiously lowered myself. Once everything felt fine, and I was confident that it wouldn't happen again, I shut my eyes. My skin was burning worse than before now, making it nearly impossible to fall asleep. I kept scratching and rubbing at my calves and thighs. "Ugh, what was in that stuff?" I muttered. Was I getting a rash? Maybe an allergic reaction to some chemical in the water? I sat upright and over the side of the bed, reaching for my phone, which was now on the side table again. I clicked the lock button and searched for my flashlight icon. As soon as I found it, I tapped it, splashing the room in light and color, and causing me to be blinded and wince for a few seconds before I adjusted to the light. The flashlight first showed the floor, because I had the phone pointing down. So when I saw the floor, or what I thought was floor, my heart began to pound. The floor pulsated like veins. What I'd assumed was carpet, because it felt like carpet under my feet, appeared more like cilia, thousands of little hair-like tendrils, each pulsating rhythmically in waves. I was absolutely shocked, astounded, horrified at what I was looking at, but my mind was still in the real world. I assumed that the floors were infested with some kind of bug, so instinctively, I jumped back onto the bed so that my feet were no longer touching the floor. But as I pulled back, my phone came with me, shining more of the room as it went. This time, it shined on the bed. I was expecting to see a wood frame, a smooth, water-containing mattress of some kind. But what I was staring down at, it had a texture resembling gums. There were purple, blue, pink veins running throughout it, and in the middle was a slit, one that I could not feel as I sat on it, one that I knew opened up, because it was in the same position as the bed that I thought broke. I didn't fall through a busted bed. I had been ingurgitated into it. As I was making this realization, the slit began to open up. Starting at the top, where I thought the bed frame was, beneath the flaps of the engorged, gum-like organelle, was a transparent green liquid, one that silently bubbled when it made contact with the air. That's what I'd fallen into, what I was almost entirely submerged in. I wanted to vomit. Bile rose up in my throat, but I held it back. There was only one thought in my mind: escape. Run, flee. Before the opening or slit opened up beneath me, I jumped off the bed. What am I saying? It's no bed. Whatever it was, I jumped off of it, forcing my bare feet to walk over the cilia-like things on the floor. I ran over to the door, unlocking it, and trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I stepped back and shone my light at the door, trying to make sure I wasn't missing a lock or something. But what I saw wasn't a door. I should have known. The door handle, it looked more like a giant centipede's mandible. The thought that I'd had my hand all over it, twisting and turning it, I thought I was going to pass out. I was lightheaded already. I didn't fully believe what I was experiencing. It had to be a nightmare. I was asleep in a bed, a real bed, and none of this was real, right? I ran over to the window. Hesitantly, I shone the light on what I thought was curtains. Sure enough, the curtains were actually thin flesh veils, veins running down from top to bottom as blood coursed through them. I forced myself, swallowing hard, to grasp hold of one side and shove it to the other, revealing an honest-to-God window, one made of glass, not bone or flesh or anything of the sort. But this window did not have a way to open it. I quickly shone my light around the room, wincing, tears running down my face as I saw more and more parts of the motel room that were actually alive. The nightstand was some sort of bony protrusion rising out of the floor, like some sort of abscessed vestigial tooth. The silhouette of a spare chair in the corner turned out to be some sort of cartilage, whose purpose I could not even fathom or guess. I glanced at the TV, the one that had been fastened to the wall. I screamed and fell to the ground at what I saw. A pulsating, slitted eye watched me. It stared without any sort of eyelid, following my every move. Had I been watched this entire time? I wanted to throw my phone at it, to get it to look away from me, but I knew that was a bad idea, and I knew then that whatever this thing was, it had been watching me long enough to know that I knew. Maybe that's why it wasn't letting me out. Suddenly, the entire room pulsated. I looked around the room with the light. The chair cartilage thing began to writhe, and so did that side table tooth. Then they shifted and broke apart from their positions, forming two separate sets of dozens of sharpened bone-like protrusions that somehow moved along the floor, all of them coming towards me. I jumped back up, pressing myself against the window. I screamed and slammed my fist against the glass, and when it cracked, even just a bit, I knew what had to be done. Violently, desperately, I punched the glass. At the very first throw of my fist, there was a crack inside my hand. It was painful, like a deep and instantaneous bruise. I'd broken it. But the pain was nothing compared to my fear. I kept punching with my injured hand, and when my body would no longer let me use it, I pulled back, then charged the glass with my shoulder. My eyes closed as I collided with it. There was the sound of shattering. My body was propelled forward by momentum as I crashed through and landed on the sidewalk. Untold numbers of scrapes and bruises enveloped my body. Everything was pain, everything was panic, but I was still able to pick myself up and limp to my car in the parking lot. But as I made it halfway there, a sound that I'd heard only recently echoed from behind me, back at the motel building. I dared to turn around to see what was making that sound.
Pay when leave.
I knew it was the man, but what I didn't know was what the man really was. Nothing here was what it seemed to be. In the direction of the front office, standing in front of the door, was the man, the clerk, still smiling, still stiff as a board. I was petrified as I saw what happened next. The false viscera that made him look like another person melted away into a pink and red puddle on the ground. Underneath his visage stood a mass of stiff, stringy, muscle-like fibers, and at the bottom, they didn't just stop. They connected in a sort of trail to the rest of the building. I stared at it for a moment, when suddenly, this snake of pure muscle fibers propelled itself forward at me at an impossible speed. If I had been any further away from my car, I'd be dead. I was just able to make it inside and insert the key before the mass of muscle slammed into the side of my car, shattering the windows on that side and denting the driver's side door inward. I screamed, twisting the key in the ignition, praying that it worked without a problem. And it did. I threw it into reverse, and I floored it. I threw the steering wheel, causing the car to turn around. When I faced the road, I kicked it back into drive, and just as I pressed the gas pedal again, the car lurched forward and began to peel out. I turned around in my seat. That mass of muscle had gripped the back axle. I wasn't going anywhere. I gritted my teeth and slammed on the gas pedal as hard as I possibly could, praying that if there was a God, to help me. help me survive and to escape. With a sickening snap and the sound of something wet hitting the back glass, the wheels finally got traction and I sped away. I made a right, heading back towards home, ignoring the first speed limit sign I saw, when suddenly the back axle just fell off the car, having been wrenched off by that thing. The loudest and most terrifying squealing resounded around me as the car scraped the ground and came to a halt. I jumped out of the vehicle and turned toward where I came from. I'd only traveled about 1/3 of a mile. I could still see the opening in the woods. I could still see the light of that motel. I got goosebumps all over. Chills ran down my spine. I stood there in the road, watching the opening, as if something was about to pop out around the corner. The ground underneath me began to rumble just a bit. I could feel it in the tips of my toes. The light in the opening turned off, as if the power in the motel had gone out. Then there was a thud, another thud, several more thuds, before something did round the corner of that opening, stepping out onto the road. I couldn't breathe for as long as I was looking at it. That motel in its entirety stood, a quadrupedal beast in the middle of the road. The same muscle fibers that had attacked me formed legs below the building, whose walls were now dripping just like the man before. Its visage in its entirety was melting off of it. It had been found out. There was no longer any reason to hide. Bits and sickening pieces of it fell off and landed in the ditch and road. What appeared to be the last room, room 12, was at the head. A mess of eyes stared at me, watched me from 1/3 of a mile down the road. It stood there for a few seconds, and I knew that if this thing came after me to devour me, I had no chance of escaping it. Not something so big that it towered over the trees now. I fell to my knees hard, scraping them against the paved road. I'd given up. In my horror, there was nothing else I could do. It had bested me. It had destroyed my only chance at escape. And besides, its mere existence had made all sense of normalcy leave my mind. I closed my eyes and prayed that it would be quick. Another thud, several more thuds, and I opened my eyes. The creature was walking across the road, paying me no mind. It walked off into and over the forest. Eventually, I could no longer see it. I could only hear distant thuds, and soon those too grew quiet. It was gone. There was no attack, there was no devourment. I was alive, and I had no idea why it let me live. It could have chased me down this road. It would have walked 1/3 of a mile in mere seconds. As I sat on the ground, confused and traumatized, I soon realized why it left me there. A helicopter flew overhead, one that was just out of reach of that monster's grasp, but would have had a perfect view of it. That thing, it was smart. It knew not to get caught, and now that I had survived, it had to find a new place to lure in prey. My luck was immense throughout this entire encounter. If I hadn't screwed up my alarm and my sleepy stupor, I never would have woke up before it was too late. I would have been digested in room 12. If I hadn't decided to examine my skin after it itched and burned in room 11, I never would have seen that monster for what it was. And if that random helicopter hadn't flown past, then I would be a goner. I walked down the road, sore and injured and tired, my mind a big blank. I didn't know what to think. My entire worldview had been changed. I walked for several hours, until finally there were lights in the distance. Headlights. They were traveling in the same direction as I was walking, toward my home. I waved them down, and they didn't hesitate to stop, probably seeing how much of a wreck I was. I crawled into the passenger side of the car, thanking the driver profusely. As I shut the door, he continued off down the road. I laid my head against the window. Everything was pounding and aching. I'd never been in so much pain. But it was over now. I was heading home. I'd survived, and I could share this experience with the world. Thanks again. So, where are you headed? I said, trying to catch my breath. I turned to look at the driver. It was a woman. A woman who seemed quite happy, whose body was so stiff it appeared a slight breeze could break her in half. I turned toward the door, yanking on the handle, but it would no longer budge. As I tried desperately to escape, I heard the telltale sound. As I type this, I can feel it burning into my scalp. I want so badly to pull the headset off, but I know exactly what will happen, and I don't think I can survive that again. When I first caught wind of the Oculus Rift, back when it was still just a Kickstarter campaign, my mind was blown. I had always dreamed as a kid of being able to step into my favorite video games. I daydreamed about saving the world, swinging the Master Sword with my own hands as Link. I visualized myself as a bored god, making sure my Sims' needs were met, or even making their lives hell. The idea of being inside the world of a game, it sounded so far off, impossible. Yet, under 2 decades later, we were on the cusp of actual, tangible VR. Sure, some people doubted it, called it fake VR, compared it to the failure of Nintendo's Virtual Boy headset. Some folks wouldn't even be happy until we had Sword Art Online levels of virtual reality. But I was satisfied simply with sight, sound, and the ability to move my arms and interact with the world more joyful than my own. Years later, VR has come a long way. We now have developers working on pixel-perfect limb movement, leg trackers, 360-degree treadmills. People are doing everything they can to make the VR experience even more real. But they have no idea that it's all pointless. Once you go too far down the rabbit hole, you get stuck in a cycle of hell. It all started when I attended a small VR expo in Chicago. With the promise of new, yet-to-be-released prototype headsets available to demo, I was guaranteed to attend. I was a VR nut now, so there was no missing something like this. The expo was thrilling. There was a new headset from a lesser-known Chinese phone company that had an insanely high resolution. The demo game looked nearly real, but you'd need a $3,000 gaming PC to run it at speeds that wouldn't make you nauseous. Even the desktop that they had hooked up to the headset was struggling to meet 60 frames per second, and even that, for VR, can make you sick. Then my personal favorite was the headset that focused on field of view. They had managed to stretch the field of view to 180 degrees. which exceeds humans' horizontal field of view and meets our vertical field of view. The more you know. When I tried this one, I could see how people could nearly forget they're even wearing a headset. It felt like putting on a different pair of eyes. Sadly, the resolution suffered, and the screen door effect was so bad, you never felt immersed. I spent several hours making multiple rounds at the event, trying a multitude of spectacular devices. As the event was coming to a close, with 20 minutes left until the building closed its doors, I spotted a modest booth that I hadn't seen previously. Strange, I thought. By then, I'd made at least a dozen laps around the entire place, yet I hadn't seen this booth before. It consisted of a single black curtain with a plain black banner boasting white Times New Roman lettering that read, "Conscious VR." I smirked. These VR titles were only getting more predictable. There was a man sitting there behind a cheap folding table, and in front of him was the boxiest-looking headset I'd ever seen. Its goggles ended in jagged edges. The strap was loose and seemed to be made of a cheap material. It was beyond generic, reverting past basic. The man himself reflected the dismal headset. He was adorned with a plain white tee, a tired expression, and eyes that had glazed over hours ago. He looked bored. I walked over. 20 minutes was plenty of time to experience one more prototype. "Conscious VR, huh?" I said with a curious inflection. The man didn't even open his mouth. "So, what's the gimmick?" I pointed to the hefty headset. "It's pretty big, so does it have a crazy field of view? Super 8K resolution? Or is it an all-in-one or something?" I knelt down and got a closer look. I didn't want to handle the thing until I got some sort of reaction from the guy. "None of that," he muttered. "Well then, what is it?" I insisted. He paused for a moment, staring at me, then to the headset. Without looking back at me, he simply said, "Wakes you up." I sneered. "What's that supposed to mean? Like a cup of coffee?" I mean, I could certainly believe that a VR game or device could be designed to get your blood pumping, so I wasn't too skeptical. "Well, how tired are you?" he asked, emotion still vacant in his words. I was getting impatient. Reaching my hands out to the headset, I looked toward the man. He nodded, granting me silent, though unenthusiastic, permission. The thing was heavier than it looked. It must have weighed 12 pounds at least. Immediately, I rolled my eyes. Whoever developed this wasted their time. Something this heavy would never be consumer or even commercially friendly. I grabbed the strap and stretched it over the back of my head. Then I laid the goggles on my forehead, struggling to find a means to adjust the tightness of it around my head before I blinded myself with it. But I couldn't find anything. No way to tighten the straps and no knob to adjust the forward position of the goggles. Nothing. "You'll need to hold it," I heard the man say, seemingly seconds away from a deep yawn. "Seriously? A headset you have to hold on to? There goes any hope of innovative or even enjoyable gameplay you could get out of it." With a sigh, I did as he instructed me. I held it at a position as comfortable as the awkward device would allow. The screen was black. "Is it on?" I asked. There was no reply. This guy was starting to piss me off. "Is there a button I need to press?" Still silence. Forget it. I wasn't going to stand there and be made a fool of by someone who should have been there to sell me on their idea. I yanked off the headset. I immediately fell backward onto the ground, breathless. Everything was black. In every direction, up, down, left, right, it was all blackness. A perfect dark that did not sway or falter. A black this flawless was unnatural, unnerving. I began to panic. I could feel my breathing speeding up and becoming more shallow. It was a struggle to pick myself back up and remain on two legs, as I could not see anything to balance myself with, no frame of reference. And when I was standing again, I attempted to look at my hands. There was nothing. I screamed, but the blackness seemed to swallow the sound, if there ever was a sound. I couldn't be sure. Was I blind? Was I deaf? Was I dead? Even though I could have sworn I already did, I kept reaching up to pull off the headset. But I felt nothing but my hair and skin. At least I was still there, I guess. Then the electricity came. A deep, sharp, stinging pain that ran through me from top to bottom like a bolt of lightning. This pain was so intense that all other thought left my mind, and though I could not see it, I felt the dribble of saliva flooding out of my mouth like some tased criminal suspect. When I woke up, my entire body was asleep, 1,000 needles per square inch of flesh. My vision had returned, and the headset was gone. I lay there in the floor of the event building alone. I sat up awkwardly, the needles slowly fading. My head was a mess of agony and confusion. The building was empty now. Had everyone left me there while packing up and leaving? Why would they do that? Had I passed out and no one cared? I picked myself up and carried myself to the glass front doors. For some reason, they weren't locked, and I was able to leave without a problem. Groggily, I made my way back to my hotel room. I had a plane to catch in the morning, and I had no way of knowing what time it was because the numbers on my phone were too blurry to read. How I made it back to my hotel bed alive or at all was a surprise. I lay there, eyes closed, enjoying the comfort of thread counts higher than I had at home. I felt fine then, save for the remnants of a headache. I looked over to the digital clock on the nightstand. 2:17 a.m. The journey back to the hotel certainly didn't take more than half an hour, so I must have been unconscious for a while. Even so, I was extremely tired. I found it difficult to keep my eyelids open, and raising my arms was a skirmish against my own body. So, with some effort, I adjusted my pillow and shut my eyes. But sleep did not come. Something was keeping me up. At first, I thought it was the headache, but it soon became clear to me that the headache wasn't actually a headache. There was an ache above my ears, wrapping around the entirety of my scalp like a circle. I could feel something there, something that hurt the longer it remained on me. For a moment, I assumed that the heavy headset had left a sore spot around my entire head. Naturally, I reached up to feel the source of my discomfort. My eyes flew open and taut. They began to water, quickly swelling to a point where tears flowed down my face. What my fingers came into contact with was not a sore on my flesh, but cloth webbing. It was the same kind of material that headset had been made of. I shot up and began to scour my own face with my hands, feeling immediately a bulky apparatus in front of my own eyes, in front of my own vision, and somehow I could not see it. Choking on my saliva, I yanked at the strap and clasped at the thing in front of my eyes, raising it above my head. In a sudden transition, the world around me changed. The hotel room disappeared as the apparatus came off of me. Around me instead was my own bedroom, my wife sleeping soundly at my side, though I recalled her having blonde hair, not auburn. The morning sun burned my retinas through the glass pane, though I recalled the window being at the opposite side of the room. Shivering, I looked down at my hands. Lying within their grasp sat a jet-black device. It wasn't the same as the Conscious VR headset that I had expected. This was more sleek, quite a bit lighter, and with a more professional design sense applied to it. My eyes strained to open wider, ready to come apart at the seams. Honey, did you really wear that to bed? I turned sharply. My wife stretched herself awake and had greeted me with a reference to this device that I thought I'd never seen before until now. What? No, Speaking was difficult. My throat was dry and trembled even more than my exterior. You always wake up acting weird when you go to bed with that thing. I told you to stop doing that. It can't be good for your brain. She climbed out of bed with a yawn and made her way to the bathroom. Yet I recalled the bathroom entrance being in the hallway. I took the moment to re-examine the headset. It looked typical. A strap, some adjustment knobs, some sort of softer than foam material applied to the inside of the goggles. If anything, it just seemed like a better quality version of the VR headsets that I remembered. But then I turned it about to see the lenses. There weren't any lenses. Rather, there in the middle of the top of the goggles sat a metal connector, a dongle of some kind, similar in shape to a USB Type-C. My mouth was agape. I reached out, touching the connector. There was some sort of brownish-red residue on the side of it. Is that blood? Instinctively, my hand flew up to my forehead where the goggles would have met my face. A chill ran down my spine. My fingers met a hole, a small hole, that perfectly matched the shape of the dongle. I must have sat there, thoughtless and silent for a moment, because the next thing I knew, my wife stood nervously at the bathroom door in a robe. Henry? Henry, is it happening again? Eyes watering, my gaze slowly met hers. I failed to blink, and I swear for a brief moment, I forgot how to breathe. In a sort of shell shock, I watched my wife pick up her phone and dial an ambulance. I was taken to the hospital. An exasperated doctor looked over my eyes and forehead thoroughly with a minuscule flashlight. Henry, you were in here just last week. I told you to take a break from that headset. My mouth didn't budge. I had nothing to say. Yes, okay. You see, your excessive use is now causing a blood leak. While not usually fatal, it can cause disorientation and even seizures. I stared down at my hands. For some reason, all I could do was listen and count my fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4. I want you to stay here tonight while we monitor your brain activity. 5, 6, 7. Are you listening, Henry? We'll keep an eye on you. But when you leave in the next couple of days, promise me you take a break from that thing. And by God, don't go back to bed with it. 8, 9, 10. The doctor spoke to my wife just outside the room. A nurse came in to apply some monitors to my heart and temples. She let me know that if I felt a seizure coming on, if I just didn't feel right, I simply needed to press this red button next to the bed. My wife came in then, kissed me, cried a bit, told me to get better. Then she left. That night, the hospital was quiet, but I lay awake, trying to figure this out. Was this reality? Had I come back to the real world from some sort of hyper-realistic escapism? And if this was the real world, why didn't I remember it? Sure, for the most part, my wife was the same. Our house was the same. The decorations were the same. The only big difference was the headset. I never remembered a headset like this existing. I didn't recall having surgery to implant an insertion point in my skull. This world was like the one I remembered, but only slightly different. My mind raced. I was beginning to wear myself down. Maybe I was overreacting to this. After all, if everything was essentially the same besides the technology of some weird headset, maybe I was worrying about nothing. I would just go home, live my life as usual, and stop worrying my wife by using that damned headset so much. I winced. My temples throbbed. It felt like they were sending some sort of current through these monitors. I reached up to feel them, and my heart seemed to stop. Webbing, a strap, another headset that I could not see. Tremors flooded me as I lowered my hands. This time, I was too terrified to immediately rip off the apparatus. I was not prepared for another transition, another revelation showing me that not even this was real. I was still in yet another virtual world. I swallowed hard, but nothing went down. My throat was drier than ever. I didn't want to do it, but I knew I had to. If I didn't reach up and pull off this headset, I would only live on not knowing, living a lie. Steadily, 1 inch at a time, my hands moved in unison up to the straps that I was now fully aware of. These were thinner, yet somehow sturdier than the last. It came off more easily. I kept my eyes shut tight and only opened them slowly once the headset was off entirely. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the brightness of the room I was in. Once I came to, I could make out a large auditorium full of hundreds of people. Laughter, excitement, just plain positivity. If I had to guess, it was an expo, but a much larger one than the one I attended with the Conscious VR booth. I quickly located a large banner toward the back of the hall that read, "Welcome. Step into Another World 2019. "What you think?" An ecstatic voice nearly shouted in front of me. "Huh?" I managed to say. I looked ahead of me. I was holding the headset, which consisted of a thin white strap and a small rectangular box, a far cry from the goggle shape I was used to. "The Cubic is great, huh? It's the smallest extraneous world device on the market." The guy was short but built. He obviously took care of himself and was very excited about this product. "Well, it's not on the market yet, but obviously we're gonna make some waves, right?" Extraneous world? Is that what they called VR here? Once again, my breathing became troublesome and stressed. This world already seemed far more different compared to the last shift. People wore hairstyles that seemed out of place to me. Several other people walked around with IVs coming from stylized backpacks and implemented into their wrists, like this world's version of vaping. A woman walked in with a species of animal that I did not recognize. Without a word, I handed the device back to him and walked away. I exited the event, searched for my wallet, and thankfully found a keycard with my information to a hotel room. When I made it back to my room, I sat down at a rolling chair in front of a tiny wooden desk where a laptop lay. I opened it. I quickly scanned over the icons. Google Chrome, Microsoft Edge, a classic RuneScape launcher. It was exactly the same as my original laptop. The brands were the same, the icon positions were the same, even the classic RuneScape played identically to what I remembered. My head collapsed into my hands as I sobbed. I wanted to scream, yet I sat convulsing in tears. Because it didn't matter that the differences still weren't major. Because it didn't matter that I could probably pick up the phone and still hear from my very same loving wife. I cried because I had absolutely no idea what original actually meant anymore. I cried because, as my face sat in the palm of my hands, in a puddle of my own tears, I could feel yet another set of webbing around my head. another strap, another headset, another fake world. I haven't shifted worlds again. I'm still in the last one, noticing more and more differences than I had before. That new Nintendo console I'd purchased a month ago, it hasn't released yet here. The Pomeranian puppy I bought my kid for their birthday, it's a German Shepherd now. But worst of all, I noticed the first major difference within one of these shifts when I flew back home. My daughter, our 5-year-old little girl who had begged me for a puppy and a bunk bed so that her friends would have a place to sleep during sleepovers. She wasn't our daughter anymore. She was now a 14-year-old he. I still feel the same love and adoration as I did, but the effects this has had on my psyche only grow, even as I continue to ignore the ache of the strap around my head. It burns, it throbs, it stings every second of every day. I can feel the pain of it. I can feel it indenting itself into my flesh on the other side. Every sore sensation screams at me to pull the headset off, but I'm too afraid. I'm afraid because I know things will get different. My definition of real will only drift further away. I don't think I can handle it again, even though I know beyond this headset there will be another, and another, and yet another. And I'm afraid that with each removed headset, I place myself closer to a more hellish reality. A reality closer to the truth. A reality where my son doesn't actually exist. A reality where I'm alone, bedridden, diseased, paralyzed, or worse. Maybe a fake world isn't the worst thing to live in. I just wish it didn't hurt so damn much. Went camping in a cold, damp national park in the northwest United States. I'm used to going camping alone, hiking alone. Never been good around people. I'd take my dogs. Tex, a big German Shepherd, and Gruff, my old geriatric pug. Gruff could barely see 4 feet in front of him, never wandered too far from me. But Tex was pretty darn independent. But he was scared of the woods. He was a big dog, and the way he'd hug up against my legs as we walked the trails made it difficult to hike. Tex did love the vistas, though. Once the woods opened up into clearings or cliffs, he'd always be excited. He just didn't like those trees and shadows, I guess. But those two ain't around anymore. And I don't go hiking anymore. Let me tell you why. Might be best to click away now if you ain't a fan of animals getting hurt. Let me get back to how I was camping in a cold, damp national park in the northwest United States, specifically in the Rockies. It was close to winter, and was as cold as you'd imagine. I'd bought Tex and Gruff the coziest little vests I could find, and I made sure we stayed real close to a big campfire by the tent. I couldn't do as much hiking as I wanted. A cold front had me thinking we'd probably call it quits early. We kept the tent set up close to the fire. Tex was asleep in the tents under some blankets he'd snuggled into, and Gruff was sniffing around the site, seeing what sort of smells he could find. I kept an eye on him. His sense of smell was as good as ever, far as I could tell, but he was nearly blind and might wander off too far. Not because he wanted to, but because he wasn't too sure where he was going. I lay back on a wad of blankets, starting to doze off myself. Gruff snorted. I raised up and looked at him. Gruff had lost his bark years ago. Now all he could do was sort of grunt and snort. Couldn't hear it from a different room had we been back at the house, but out here in the dead of night, it was clear as crystal. Looking over, he was just sitting there, peering into the woods. "What you see, boy?" I asked, not actually expecting an answer the way dog owners do. I'm not sure he heard me, though. He didn't react. Kept staring into the dark. Tex whimpered behind me, apparently awake now. Nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard it. I looked toward him, and he was scurrying backward into the tent wall. What the heck? I looked toward the darkness now, too, wondering what these dogs were seeing or sensing that I couldn't. Started thinking about dogs' visual range. They see through the dark better than we can. Imagining a possum that I couldn't see, waddling through the dark, nearly had me laugh. Gruff was curious, and Tex was a big baby, just like always. But then Gruff got back up on his back legs, seemed curious, and he began to walk forward. "Gruff, no," I called to him. He knew better than to go too far. A quick reminder should do the trick. But he ignored me. So I called again. "Gruffy, get back here." I began to pick myself up to go and carry him back. Gruff went further forward, paw by paw, until the light from the campfire couldn't reach him. The next thing I knew, there was a muffled yelp, the sound of something big swatting or slapping at the ground. My eyes shot over toward that direction. I'd only looked away for a moment to pick myself up, and Gruff was gone. Only thing left was a cloud of dirt that had been kicked up. I swallowed hard. Felt as if my heart was rising up in my throat. I felt mad too, but also scared. Where was my dog? Tex was going mad then, clawing desperately at the back of the inside of the tent, trying to rip a hole through it. "Tex, no! Lay down!" I tried to command him to calm down. He wasn't having it. Started using his teeth on the nylon. I was panicking too. Had no idea what to do or where Gruff had gone. I tried to crawl over to Tex slowly. Thought I could pet him and ease him into letting me leash him up to one of the stakes. Then I could go look for Gruff and bring him back. I placed my hand on his back. But then Tex snaps, yelping and digging his teeth into my hand, before continuing to gnaw at the tent. I fall back, cursing. I looked at my hand, and he had drawn blood. The heck was wrong with him? He had never attacked me before. Matter of fact, I'd never seen him bite another living thing like that. He then tore through the fabric after a few more seconds. I couldn't stop him. He tried to jump through the hole then, but as he did, a similar smack or swatting sound echoed from just outside the tent. Tex's body went limp. I couldn't see more than his lower half because the rest of him was already outside the tent because he was trying to escape. "Tex, come here, boy. You okay?" I called over to him. Suddenly, his body was yanked through the hole entirely, unimaginably fast. Bile rose in my throat. Soon I realized I was choking rather than breathing. I crawled instinctively closer to the campfire. The forest around me was silent. There were bugs chirping and wind blowing through the trees, but nothing else. No sign of movement around the campsite. No sign of anything wrong, except for my 2 missing dogs. I quickly crawled over to where Gruff had gone, fumbling my phone out of my pocket, turning on the flashlight. I followed Gruff's little paw prints until they stopped. Where he had disappeared was this set of thick indentations in the dirt. It reminded me of something. I placed my hand, palm down, in the dirt beside me, squeezing some dirt in my hand and lifting it up. The shapes I left in the dirt below looked the same, but way smaller. It was as if a far larger hand had done the same thing to my dog. To both dogs. Out of breath, I circled the camp with the light, pointing it in every direction, but there was nothing but trees. It didn't make sense. I turned off the flashlight and dialed my wife. She didn't answer. 2 times, 3 times, a dozen times I called. No answer. Then I dialed 911. The operator picked up. I informed them that I was in the Rockies. Someone attacked and possibly killed my dogs, and might still be out there trying to hurt me. But then a familiar tone sounded in my ear. I looked at the phone screen, and a phone brand logo was animating. My phone had died. It was shutting down. I cursed under my breath several times, crawling again, not sure why I was too scared to stand up, as I tried to find my backpack. I soon find it, but I can't find my mobile charger, which was supposed to be in there. No, I think. I left it at home, didn't I? I stayed close to the fire then, not blinking for minutes at a time, my head like a sprinkler shifting back and forth, ready for anything to emerge from the dark and come right at me. But it never did. I stayed in the same spot, trying not to doze off. It blew my mind that my body was still trying to fall asleep after seeing something like this. The fire behind me was dying down to embers and orange coals. Then I hear movement. My heart rate spikes up again. I look up. Something shoots right past me, landing in front of me at the edge of the firelight. It's an owl, thank God. I can see it more clearly. My eyes have adjusted pretty well, and the moon shining through the canopy was a godsend. The owl looks at me with those big eyes. Not sure what it was doing down here until I noticed a mouse struggling between its talons. I guess it wasn't in too much of a hurry to fly back up and have that snack. I watched as the mouse broke free from the owl. The owl's head turns and follows the mouse as it runs towards the darkness. The owl's wings open up as it awkwardly pursued the rodent, and then smack. I see it this time. It's much closer than Gruff had been when it happened. A massive hand came down, pointed at the tips like claws. It swept up the bird and mouse both before pulling away. This hand was attached to a long, spindly arm with tiny, sharp offshoots, and attached to that was a thin and a rigid body. This body pulls the hand inwards until there's a nearly inaudible crunching sound. Then the silhouette of the thing goes motionless. I realized then that the outline of the creature looked perfectly like a tree in the dark. I was panicking all over again. There were trees everywhere. There could be many of those things everywhere around me. Or if there was one, then I might lose track of it, and it could be anywhere. I stopped and took a breather. I had another realization. That thing seemed to only reach for things away from the fire. I couldn't leave. I was trapped here. I had to get the fire going again, too, before it died out completely. But I could not venture into the forest for wood. I glanced over to my blankets and backpack in the tent. I did what I had to do. The pack and fabrics made a billow of smoke as they blazed, but they stayed lit for far longer than I expected. I managed to keep the fire blazing until sunrise. When the sun was shining in full force, I picked myself up, didn't grab anything except for my dead phone. and I scanned the tree line. All the trees looked like trees. That was enough for me to break into a full-on run, and I didn't stop until I was forced to collapse on one of the trails. And there I was found by some hikers. People like me. Or rather, people who had no idea what sort of nightmares actually lurk in those woods. I managed to make it out, unsure of what I'd seen, vowing never to go back. When I made it home, I cried, letting my wife know that something out there had attacked and killed our dogs. When she asked what it was, I told her my honest truth. I don't know. But I'll let you know that if you're ever in the Rockies, you find yourself out there after dark, stay by the campfire and don't let it die out. I didn't really like my stepdad. He wasn't a bad guy, I just didn't know him very well. And he took my dad's place, which didn't really sit well in my head or my heart. You see, my dad died while exercising one day. He was an avid jogger. He seemed so healthy to everyone, but the next thing we knew, an ambulance was driving down the street, racing to my dad's lifeless body. I believe it was an aneurysm. Not really sure what caused it, though. A couple of years later, my mom, being lonely, found someone new, someone I didn't want to accept. Craig was a nice guy. He was in his early 50s, loved playing video games with my brother and sister, and he took every opportunity he had to try to bond with me. But I wasn't ready to open up yet. Not even when my mom offered that the two of us take a weekend to go hiking in the mountains. She'd been wanting Craig to get more in shape. He wasn't nearly as in shape as my dad. Then again, neither was I. But I did enjoy the outdoors. Craig obliged, but I was hesitant, imagining just how awkward it was going to be, just me and Craig out in the woods. It didn't sound too fun. One night when my mom pulled me aside after dinner, she begged me to go with him. I was 17 years old, and I would be graduating next year, moving out of state for college. She dreaded the idea of the two of us not knowing each other very well, not getting along. So, to make her happy, we began planning a trip to the mountains. It was nearly fall, right before school started back up. We were carrying big bags, equipped with a tent, some flashlights, batteries, fire starters, because we weren't going to be able to do that castaway style. Craig had also gone shopping and bought some MREs and a bunch of astronaut treats, those freeze-dried ice cream bars and candy bars and such. He thought it'd be fun to pig out on them the first night. After we got a camp set up, of course. To be quite honest, seeing him so excited to go hiking with me, it really helped me loosen up on the trip. We soon pulled up at the start of the hiking trail on a Friday evening. It was a couple of hours until sundown, but there were plenty of places along the trail to camp at, so we weren't worried about not being able to find a spot fast enough. As we were unloading the gear from the truck, another truck pulled up next to us. A father and his two sons who appeared to be going fishing down by the nearby river. As the two of us got started along the trail, I looked back one last time before the trees enveloped my view of the parking lot. I saw the father and the kids unloading some fishing rods. When the father asked the kid, who appeared to be his oldest or biggest son, to grab the tackle box under the back seat, By then, the trees around us had overtaken our view. It was now just us and nature, and a slowly reddening sky. After about 15 minutes of a walk, we ended up setting camp in a small clearing, which sat several yards to the right of the trail. If any other hikers happened to walk by and turn their head, they'd be able to see us pretty clearly. The two of us fumbled with getting the tent set up, eventually laughing each time we failed to do so. When we managed to rig it in a way that it wouldn't fall, we collapsed on the ground, tired, and getting pretty hungry. Craig whipped out 2 astronaut ice cream sandwiches from his backpack, tossing one at me. It was a Neapolitan flavor, you know, strawberry, vanilla, then chocolate. It was dry as heck, as expected, but really delicious. I see some kindling back there not too far behind you. Would you grab it? We'll get a fire going. Craig requested. I nodded and did as he asked. I brought back a mess of twigs. We made a slight hole in the ground and put the twigs inside. He poured some lighter fluid on it and set it ablaze. Then slowly, one by one, he piled on some small logs, until there was a full-blown fire before us. He began to pull out 2 of those collapsing camping chairs. We'd brought those along too, though I think he was regretting it. Carrying just one of those heavy and awkwardly sized things was a bit much, especially for a long hiking trip. But at least we'd have something to sit down on that wasn't dirty or wooden. He passed me the light blue, and he sat down in a lime green. With a big sigh, he asked me, "How you holding up so far?" I swatted at a gnat or mosquito or something on my neck, then answered, "I love being out here, but never really went camping much." "Well, you probably can't tell," Craig said, smacking his beer belly, then laughing. "But I'm no outdoorsman either." "So, what you hungry for? Beef stew or chicken soup?" He pulled out a couple of MRE bags, then dangled them in front of me to let me choose. Your choice," I answered, not really knowing what to say. I'd never really had an MRE before, and I wasn't too sure they'd be very good. "Beef stew it is." He placed the other bag back in the backpack, then carefully began to read the immense instructions on the back of that bag. After watching him for way too long trying to figure it out, he finally managed to get the bag to the point where the food was heating up inside. We had to sit a couple more minutes before it was done. There was an awkward silence for a while. I think Craig was trying to figure out what to say to me. And to be fair, I didn't know what to say to him either. Suddenly, he blurted out, "So, how's school been? Got a particular girl in your life?" I smirked. I don't know why, but him asking me that, it made me feel irritated. Sure, hiking along the way here and chatting it up and cooperating has been fine for me. But I think it was because those activities weren't exclusive to a father and son. But when he asked me about school, it reminded me of how my dad would ask how school was after I'd come home, and I didn't like that. This may sound immature and even mean, but it made me feel like he was pretending to be my dad, but he wasn't. In my head, he was not my dad. He was just a strange man who met my mom, and they happened to get along together. I felt forced to know him, and now I felt forced to bond with him. Looking back on this now, I feel so bad. But back then, my head was filled with anger, rebellion, and the only thing I could think to say was, "That's not your business, Craig." "Oh, no, I'm sorry. I understand, but..." Craig apologized swiftly, his sincerity stumbling out as words I couldn't piece together. Eventually, he caught up with himself and breathed in real deep. "What I meant to say was, I know, maybe that was a personal question. Well, I want to be your friend first. I know I'll never be your dad. I know that. But I do want to be your friend. Is that okay?" I suddenly felt guilt for reacting the way I did, but that was soon replaced with feeling embarrassment for myself. I felt stupid, and I felt awkward. I wasn't ready for the sudden heart-to-heart. I began to stand up, when suddenly, something landed right in front of us, landing right on the fire and putting it out all at once. I fell back into my chair, and Craig shouted. The two of us looked down at the campfire together, and there we saw the strangest thing. There was no trace of the dark object we saw briefly fall between us. There was no trace of an impact on the fire either. Instead, the fire was out. Well, it wasn't out, actually. It was as if it had never been started. The hole was there that we dug for the fire, and my kindling was waiting to be lit. There was no trace of the twigs being burned. As a matter of fact, the small logs that Craig had placed in the fire were now gone. "What in the world?" he said, then turned around where he'd kept the logs. "Oh my God," he muttered. "What? Craig, what is it?" I was feeling a bit nervous then. Without turning around, he instead beckoned me with his hand. I came over and looked over his shoulder. There on the ground was each and every log he had found and gathered, including the ones he had placed in the fire. They'd somehow returned to their spot behind him and were not charred or burnt at all. How is that possible?" I asked. "You're asking me? I've got no idea," he admitted. "It's like a glitch in the Matrix, I guess." I think he was trying to make light of the situation. It wasn't really scary. It was just really confusing, because neither of us had any idea what had just happened. Soon after that, we prepared the tent and got ready to go to sleep. As we got cozy in our sleeping bags, just when things were supposed to get quiet, we instead heard a noise in the distance, sounding like it was coming from above us, like it was coming from the sky. The noise was like a metallic hum. It was one note, playing slowly for the next hour. We sat there listening to it, wondering what it could be from. I guessed it was a plane or something, but there weren't any airports or bases near us. If it was a plane flying overhead, it would have been long gone in a couple of minutes. Craig made a joke about it being just a really weird bird. I didn't know how to reply. He eventually fell asleep, and after several more minutes of confusion, I was too tired to keep my eyes open. In the morning, we packed up, heading further up the trail. The plan was to make it to the peak and then go back down, camping another night before going home. But plans be damned. We never did make it to the peak. 3/4 of the way up, the humming sound we'd heard in the sky the previous night came again. This time, it was ahead of us. Not above us at all, but ahead of us. Like, if we kept walking, we'd run into it, whatever it was. With curiosity, we kept going, albeit more slowly than before. At the next bend in the trail, I stepped around the corner first and stopped. It took everything I had just to keep breathing. "Oh my God," I said, and Craig came rushing up to me, asking what was going on, but then he was breathless too the next second. Ahead of us, where the canopy in the trees opened up just above the trail, hovered 3 vortexes. They're hard to describe. They were these black voids sort of spiraling and swirling in on themselves. Each of them hovered a few feet off the ground. I was so awestruck and dying for an explanation for these things that it took me a minute or two to notice the dead deer on the ground. It was a buck. It seemed to have been freshly killed by something. Its midsection was all torn up. They began to descend, these vortexes, onto the carcass. Must have taken them a couple more minutes to do so, they descended so slowly. All the while, Craig and I were dead silent. When these black, spinning things made contact with the deer's body, a great wind began to well out from it, pushing us back. We struggled to keep our footing, and we looked on, trying to see what was going to happen. The three black objects suddenly formed together and disappeared instantly. There was no flash of light, no sudden blackout, nothing like that. They were just gone. Maybe we just couldn't comprehend how they left. But looking back on the trail, the deer's carcass was gone. There were no signs of a struggle in the dirt, no markings at all that the things could have left, no sign of a great wind. Craig, in utter disbelief, ran over to where the deer had been laying before. He was pawing at the ground, muttering, "It doesn't make sense. How is that possible?" before looking back at me. "I don't think it's safe here," he confessed. Suddenly, there was a deep snort or huff to the left of us. I ran over to Craig, a bit scared, and stood next to him. We both faced the woods and saw a buck standing there, perfectly healthy. The horns and that color of fur, they looked the same as the deer that had just been lying on the ground. Its ears twitched at the sound of a twig snapping nearby. Before I could see what it was coming from, Craig had grabbed me by the arm and told me to run. I kept looking back, though, as we did so. The deer had begun to run as well, but a large cat, a mountain lion I think, had fallen down onto it and was now tearing into its midsection. Tearing into it at the exact same spot we'd found its carcass before. We were running down the trail now. "We need to go home. I don't think it's right here. I'm really sorry. I was having fun." He looked at me, out of breath, and as if asking permission, he said, "Maybe we can do something else sometime soon. Would that be okay?" I swallowed hard, and I nodded. We started to slow down. We were exhausted now, and it was almost dark again. "I'm not sure where we are," Craig said. "I've got no idea how close we are to the bottom." I sighed. "I don't either, and I really don't want to get lost. Maybe we should set up camp again. We could keep going in the morning." Craig thought it over for several seconds. I may have suggested it, but I had no idea if it was the right decision. We didn't know what the black things were, or if they were even alive. Didn't know if they were dangerous. We just felt weird about the whole thing. Yeah, you're right. We'll stay another night, and in the morning, we'll find our way back down. We set up the tent again. We were much more efficient this time. We got some firewood and had a fire going pretty quick. This time the fire was much bigger. Guess we both had a newfound fear of the dark out here. We didn't say anything to each other the rest of the night, and when we went to bed in the tent, we made sure not to put the fire out this time. We just had to have a nightlight. Before we went to sleep, though, there was one thing said. From his sleeping bag, Craig said to me, "Good night. I'll make sure to get you home safe tomorrow, I promise." Once again, that feeling of being told something that my dad should be telling me came over me. A bit of anger bubbled to the top, and I couldn't help but reply, "I'm not your responsibility, you know. You don't even have to be here." Craig didn't say anything after that, but I could feel that he wanted to. He just didn't know what to say. And just as before, I immediately felt guilt and embarrassment. Until I fell asleep, I kept repeating in my head, "I shouldn't have said that." I woke up in the middle of the night, and as soon as I heard what had woke me up, my eyes grew wide. It was the humming sound again. It was close, but quiet. I sat straight up and reached over to wake up Craig, but his sleeping bag was empty. When I turned to face the entrance to the tent, the flap was open. I slowly poked out my head and I looked around. Didn't take me long to see that Craig was standing just beyond the campfire. He seemed to be staring at something, and when I felt a powerful gust of wind around me, I got out of the tent and I called out towards Craig. "Are you all right?" I asked. He didn't reply or move. I ran up to him and grabbed him by the shoulder, but he didn't budge. And then I saw what was before him. A large black vortex, another one, but bigger than any we'd seen yet, and Craig had reached out his hand to touch it. Just before it made contact, I tried to blurt out to tell him to stop. I was even a second away from yanking on his shoulder to separate him from the thing, but it was too late. He touched it. The vortex disappeared, and Craig was gone. One moment, I felt his warm shoulder under my palm, and the next moment, I was latching on to nothing but the night air. Tears welled in my eyes, and then I remembered before. When this happened at the campfire, the logs had just appeared where they were, and when it happened to the deer had reappeared where it had been. I ran around the campsite, but Craig was not there. I ran up and down the trail for 20 yards or so, but Craig was nowhere to be seen. I went back to the campsite and crawled into the tent just to check, and there he was. Craig was in his sleeping bag, but his eyes were wide open, and they were looking straight up. "Craig, are you okay?" Craig didn't even blink. From the movement of his sleeping bag, his chest rising and falling underneath, I knew he was alive, but he wasn't responsive. I waved my hand in front of his eyes, trying to get him to flinch, to blink, to respond in some way, but he wouldn't budge. Worried and morbidly curious, I crawled up right next to him, looked him in the eye, and slowly lowered my finger. I must have been only a millimeter away from touching his eyelid when I pulled my finger back. He wasn't going to respond to me. It was like he was catatonic. I was crying full on now, tears dripping onto Craig's sleeping bag. I kept calling out to him, even shook him, but nothing would happen. What had he done? Why did he touch that thing? And the last thing I said to him, I told him he didn't have to be here. Guilt had risen up in me more than ever before. I packed up everything, then searched Craig's bag for a cell phone. He hadn't brought one, because he didn't want any distractions from spending time with me. And I didn't have one because I'd simply forgotten to bring it. Great. When all that was left to pack up was the tent and Craig's sleeping bag, which I obviously wasn't able to, I tried to pick him up, but he was bigger than me. I tried to drag him, but that wasn't going to work. I hated the idea of it, but I knew that if I was going to get help, I'd have to leave him here. I tossed more logs in the fire, making sure that he would have plenty of light and warmth. I zipped up his tent real well, so that nothing could get inside. Before I walked down the trail, leaving him in the small clearing, I looked back. Then I whispered, "I'm sorry." I took off running down that mountain, but the trail seemed longer than it had before. I ran and ran, tumbling a few times at the weight of my backpack. Soon it was sunrise, letting me know that I'd been running for literally hours, even though the trip up to the highest point, where we'd found the deer, had taken no less than 3 or 4 hours of hiking. How could I have run several hours straight downhill and not be at the bottom? There was something truly wrong with this place, and I was soon struggling with the idea that I might not ever make it back. Soon the sun was high in the sky, and I was still running. I had no idea where I was getting the energy. I must have been crying the entire night. My eyes and my cheeks were sore, where tears had fallen and dried up. My face felt like a swollen mess. Just when I thought I was going to give up, I landed on a straightened and familiar part of the trail. I looked up, straight ahead, where I would have expected the trail to end. But what I saw was different. There was darkness. A wall of sheer black, a black that seemed to swirl in on itself, a black that gave off a strong wind. I looked left and right. This black wall seemed to extend for as far as I could see between the trees. I walked close to it. I followed it to the left for several meters. Still all darkness. I came back to the trail I was on, then went right. And again, nothing but black wall, like the blackness itself was shielding me from exiting the mountain. I came back to the trail, and I looked at it. There was only one way we were going to get off this mountain. I had to make it through. I took in a deep breath, and I swallowed down hard. I grabbed onto my backpack straps, as if they were lifelines. I closed my eyes, and I began to approach the black wall. My breathing became frantic, and my footsteps became less sure, but I kept going. One step. The already strong wind got even more rough, as if it was trying to pry open my eyelids, but I kept them closed. 2 steps. The wind was so strong against my face, it felt as if it was pushing me back, and it was making it hard to breathe. 3 steps. The wind died down immediately. The humming noise that had surrounded me had just stopped. When I opened my eyes, it was a couple of hours away from sunset, and there in front of me was the parking lot. Craig's truck was there, and to my left, a father and 2 sons, one of whom was excitedly racing to the back seat of the truck, pulling out a tackle box from underneath the seat. I was dumbfounded, and I turned around, expecting to see a black wall at the tree line. But what I was actually met with brought more tears to my eyes. I smiled. "Whoa, you okay? If you don't want to go hiking, we don't have to. I mean..." It was Craig. Happy and healthy and ready to begin our hike. It was like nothing ever happened. Not wasting another moment, I went with what he said. "Craig, I'm feeling really sick. I think we need to go home." He hadn't realized I would take him up on his offer, so he started to ask if I was sure. He frowned, obviously disappointed. "Are you sure? Maybe we can wait it out and you'll feel better." Shoving my tongue in the back of my throat and forcing myself to think about everything that had happened, I was able to make myself vomit. "Okay, let's get back in the truck. We'll just go hiking another time." He helped me back to the truck. I sat in the passenger seat. Then he got in the driver's seat. His look of disappointment was worse now. I wiped my mouth and caught my breath. When I settled down, I looked at him and touched his shoulder. The same shoulder I'd latched onto when he disappeared. I told him, I'm not trying to get out of it, I promise. How's about we do something else this weekend? I think it'd be a lot of fun. Just the 2 of us." He looked at me and smiled. He seemed relieved. "Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun." Never swim in the ocean at night. It's what my uncle always told me. Never swim in the ocean at night. Ever since I can remember, my uncle has lived on the East Coast in a humble yet cozy stilt home. He's a widower, a fisherman, and a great storyteller. Mom and Dad would drop my brother and I off at his place on some weekends in the summer. He'd take us fishing, cook us homemade fish and chips, then regale us with stories about, you could probably guess, fishing, the Korean War to my mom's disapproval, and the ocean in general. My uncle was a man who loved and feared the ocean. According to him, he lost some friends in that war during a naval battle. It was a fight that had left him injured and drifting in the water for nearly 18 hours. He says he was terrified of who would find him first, the North Korean forces or the sharks. In the end, it was a South Korean patrol boat that picked him up. He made it back to shore in one piece and was honorably discharged thereafter. I remember thinking how terrifying that would be, trapped in the ocean for nearly a full day and being completely clueless as to your own fate. Being 11 years old the first time I heard this story, I fell asleep that night to the sound of waves and the occasional passing boat of night fishermen. A nightmare came to me in which I was floating alone in a dark ocean under a somehow darker sky. No stars to keep me company. Suddenly, I felt teeth, hundreds of them nibbling on me. An unseen creature, or creatures, devoured me slowly from bottom to top. Just as it took my eyes, I woke up. Afterward, the white noise of waves outside the house became something dreadful, at least until morning. When everyone was awake, I took the chance to spill my morbid curiosity. I asked my uncle what the worst was that happened during his time being adrift at sea. I regret ever asking that question. It wasn't the pruning and blistering of his skin, he explained. It wasn't the burning from the sun amplified like a magnifying glass by the water. No. The worst thing, according to him, was the night. Never swim in the ocean at night. He gave me the same warning he always had, yet this iteration seemed somehow darker, more ominous. His face had been somber and his skin taut when my uncle spoke that morning. It was an emotion I'd never seen before. My stomach twisted as the moisture in my mouth dissipated. I clenched my teeth and pretended not to be nervous. My uncle then shared his most horrifying experience with me, seemingly forgetting that he was talking to an 11-year-old child. The water isn't so bad once you get used to it. For a while there, the waves start to make you motion sick, but even that passes after a few hours. You find yourself staring at the sky, looking to the clouds for company. The sun blinds you and scorches your skin while the salt water chafes everything from the neck down. Each moment, you think about just how alone you are. In every direction, there's an infinite distance before and beyond the horizon. Nothing but water with blue sky stretching down to touch it. They say you feel almost weightless in the water, but that's not true at all. Back then, I felt heavier than I ever did before. Uniform expanded by salty water, bloated skin by a rotting bullet wound, an ever-present stress gnawing at you from the inside. But that's not where the weight comes from. Holding on to that stray splinter of wood, keeping me afloat, it felt like being nailed to driftwood with the weight of an endless flood pressing on you from all around. The sun lowered from the sky, inch by inch. I was immersed in despair I never thought possible in this physical world. But when the sun sank below the horizon, True dread, like all the world's deepest, darkest fears, knitted into colorless tapestry, fell over me. The feeling of lonesomeness that had been the day had vanished. In the shadow-laden sea, the eerie feeling of accompaniment was the rule. Yet even in my tortured state, I knew it was either one of two things: paranoia, or a reminder that in these oceans predators lurked. Sharks, colossal squid, and other unnamed terrors that tarry in the ever-darkening depths. I tried to keep my mind from wandering. I tried to focus on my triumph over this place, when I'd see American forces shining a splendorous light on my pale and shivering face. But that was not yet to come. Drifting by the whim of nature, I lay my head on its side upon the wooden plank. I shut my eyes as if I dared to fall asleep. But a sound caught my attention. I lifted my head and scanned my never-motionless surroundings. The sound was like water washing up against the pilings that support a dock, like the surf riding past something disrupting the flow of water. My eyes searched the shadowed horizon until they fell upon a silhouette. I struggled to breathe, but no water had entered my lungs at that moment. My legs kicked in search of ground I could push off of, trying to bring distance between myself and this figure. I'm sure you might expect me to say I'd seen a shark fin emerge from the water, or that a rising rogue wave formed in the distance. I'm sad to say this was something far less explainable. It was Gregor, one of my friends I'd watched die in the attack hours earlier. Defying logic, he stood upon the water facing away from me, waves brushing up to his knees but never dampening his tattered uniform. The gaping hole torn through him by blazing shrapnel remained, stars in the sky shining within it from my perspective. And though I thrashed about, I saw he was not alone. To my left stood my little brother in the same manner, away from me, silent and motionless, still as young as he had been, 9 years old. I think I shed a tear then, but it might have been the tide. Before long, I had noticed the crowd, a dozen, probably more, visages of those I had known in life gathered as soaked sentinels, still upon turbulent waters. Though my eyes stung from the undulating waves, I found myself unable to blink, my mind a muddled mess. I soon pieced together the commonality of my guests. Each one I had wronged in life. My younger brother, who had been run over, having been forced to walk to school when I had hidden his bicycle out of spite. He'd have already been at school with me otherwise. My comrade, who had perished on the very ship I'd fled after I'd been too cowardly to go back for him. If I'd helped free him from the rope that had knotted around his legs, we might both be here to struggle for another sunrise. My mother, whom I had scorned as I had never visited her at what would become her deathbed. There was also my father, as well as an elderly neighbor, and a lost love. All friends and loved ones I had let down, each now perished. And yet I floated there, begging fate for a new chance at life, as if I deserved one. I swear to you then, they all turned in concert, gasping at the sight of their faces, each at different stages of rot. I slipped from my wooden lifeline, a splinter stabbing into my finger as I submerged. Immediately, I reached for the surface, while my hands slipped through to the air. My face was met with the wall of decomposing hands, some small, others adult, all keeping me just a scarce breath away from oxygen. No matter how much I fought against them, these hands were impenetrable. I soon grew exhausted. I could no longer hold my breath, let alone keep pulling myself further up. My body stopped. I let go. As I sank, a different kind of blackness set over my vision. But a cutting light forced the hands above me to scurry away, vanquishing the darkness. A hand, one both whole and warm, reached into the water and pulled me back to the surface. Hardly conscious, I remember a South Korean man helping me into a patrol boat. The beam of a searchlight reminded me of the sun in both brightness and heat. I had been saved. Yet, child, to this day, I cannot with honesty tell you if I deserved it. My uncle concluded his story. My heart pounded as if I'd been the one to live the events he spoke of. A newfound fear of the water that nearly surrounded his home accompanied my thoughts. With a quick, "Don't tell your mother," he took off to take care of some crabs held captive in his lines. My brother, who had been watching TV the entirety of the story, was spared this nightmare. And so I say to you, never go swimming in the ocean after nightfall. Else those beyond life who wish their vengeance upon you might seek it. Never walk alone on a wooded road, because you'll find something, or something will find you, that will change your life forever. My legs were exhausted. I'd been walking along that dark wooded road for about 3 hours by then, and my body was ready to call it quits. I missed the luxury of my car, but it had broken down several miles back, and my phone, it was dead. It had been dead since I got in the car. I was never very good about keeping my things charged, but at that time, I hated myself for it. I wanted to be home, warm in my bed, but I wouldn't even be close to my town for another 3 or 4 hours. About halfway there, I reminded myself, trying to keep the spirits up. I should have stayed in the car, part of me thought. Honestly, I only got out of the car, thinking that if I began walking, I could wave someone down and hitch a ride. But for the past 3 hours, not one person had stopped. In fact, not one person had passed by. It was the most quiet I'd ever seen this road. That was really saying something. I was very familiar with this place, as well as attached to it. Not only was it the quickest route to my grandparents' place, but it was also a place that my dad and I spent a lot of time in. There were miles upon miles of hiking trails in those woods. Trails my dad and I were well acquainted with. Not only that, but I remember one occasion when my dad and I were driving back home from my grandparents, and on this very road, my dad encountered an injured deer. He stopped the car on the side of the road in hopes of helping the poor creature. I remember being so little, wondering what the two of us could do for an injured deer. I stayed in the car and watched through the windshield. The next thing I knew, my dad stood up, and so did the deer, which began to walk away, but stopped only for a moment to look back at my dad, as if to acknowledge the help. Then it turned and disappeared into the woods. When my dad walked back into the car, I asked him what he did. He said he had found a piece of glass in one of its hooves. How that deer got glass in his hoof, I don't know. But that day was a memory of my father that I would hold on to and cherish for the rest of my life. My father had been a good and kind man, and a great dad. Sure, he and my mother fought a lot when I was a kid, but they loved each other dearly, passionately. Opposites attract, they say. And I do realize that my dad was never the same after my mom walked out on us when I was younger. But in spite of his faults, and everything he's ever done for me, I love and miss that man. Because when I turned 14, my dad passed away. I miss him dearly. Ever since then, I cherished my time driving on this road and walking in the woods around it. Thinking about my father as I walked along the dark road, I was suddenly reminded about a particular negative memory. A specific part of this road that my dad was always wary of. You see, there was this portion of the road. It wasn't much different from the other parts of it, save for one thing. A near ancient stump that had been there for as long as I could remember. The part of the stump that faced the road. It was covered in fungus and moss. I noticed that insects would land on that side with ease. The other side, facing the woods, it was all dark and rotted. A disgusting color between gray and brown that no natural living thing should be. Yet despite that half of it looking so awful, it never did cave in or fall away. Never did seem to rot away at all. It always looked like if you kicked it real good on that side, it would just smush in on itself, like some sort of old soggy log. But I never dared try, never dared get close to it. I had no reason to be afraid of the stump. It was only because of my dad's fear that drove me to inherit it. As I said before, my dad and I would walk in these woods, even along the roads. But every time we'd come close to this stump, he would lead me away from it, taking a much larger detour so as to not come close to it. I even saw his wariness of it when we drove down this road. He wouldn't look at it, and he would stay completely quiet during that segment, no matter how much I tried to push him into a conversation, or even ask why he was so weird about that stump. He would stay quiet until he could no longer see it in his rear view, and if he was driving towards it and saw it coming up in the distance, he would quickly speed up a good 10 or 15 miles per hour just to get past it more quickly. And as I remembered that old stump, I also recalled that I hadn't passed it yet, and I would be coming up on it soon enough. I continued to walk and walk and walk, becoming more and more creeped out as I got closer to it. Then again, walking alone on a dark road at night, getting a little bit creeped out is sort of inevitable. About 20 minutes later, I saw its silhouette forming in the distance in front of me. Of course, I was walking on the same side of the road as it. I hadn't even thought about that. I walked a little faster now, mirroring my dad's actions when he used to see the stump. I even instinctively tried to avoid looking at it directly. But as I began to remember my dad and think of him more, I began to feel more and more empowered, silly, thinking that surely my dad wouldn't want me scared of the stump as well. Besides, it could have just been me reading too much into things when I was younger. I was at a full sprint, ignoring my sore legs. About 2 minutes later, I was standing right in front of the thing. It hadn't changed a bit. The left side where the road was lush with color. It was thick with moss and fungus, alive with nighttime insects. A moth rested on one of the mushrooms. A snail searched for food under one of the mushroom caps. And a firefly light strobed on one of the patches of moss. I turned my head only slightly. Even now, the dark side of the stump appeared ready to collapse at any moment. I thought to myself, I could probably just breathe on it, and the wood would fall in. Would probably be doing people favors, so they wouldn't have to look at that nasty side of the stump from now on. With a sigh and a smirk, I walked over to that side of the thing. I felt way too confident. Here sat this thing that my father was afraid of for so long. Maybe, just maybe, I might do him a favor. I took a couple of steps back, then got a decent running start. Placing all of my weight into my left foot, I kicked at the side of the rotten end of the stump. For some reason, I expected it to be rough, hard, expected my kick to have no effect, as if there was some sort of magical property to this dang stump. But when my foot made contact, I could barely feel anything. It was like kicking a big wet sponge. A landslide of bark flew off of the thing, the rotten side of the stump nearly separating itself perfectly from the lush side. I smiled for a moment, catching my breath after the sudden outburst. I looked down at the mush of old bark, and before I could feel triumph at what I had done, I covered my mouth and held back a scream. There, under the bark that I had just kicked, there was a hand, a withered hand nearly the same color as that rotten wood around it. Horrified, I dropped to the ground. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. I found myself crawling closer, needing to know if it was really a human hand that was poking through the soil. I crawled with utter reluctance toward the stump, or what remained of it, driven only by morbid curiosity. When I was next to it, I began to dig and pull at the soil that was loose with my hands. As I revealed more of what was underneath, I stopped, now unable to breathe. It was a face, withered just as much as the hand, if not more, but a face that was recognizable nonetheless. A face I recognized. It was my mother. I wanted to throw up. I wanted to keel over right then and there, to be lost to that wooded road, like my mother, apparently. And as my mind could not form a proper thought, as if on cue by some higher power who had been waiting for me to make this discovery, an old pickup truck drove by, saw me on the side of the road, and stopped. An old man asked me if I was okay. I couldn't even look at him. But sure enough, he followed my gaze to the stump. He cursed under his breath, running back to his truck to grab his phone and call the police. Later on, forensics revealed that it was in fact my mother. My mother who never ran away. My mother who never abandoned us. My mother who had been killed by my father and buried under this old tree stump. I now know why my dad feared it, and I can't help but wonder if that side of the stump rotted like that as a signal. One last cry for help from my late mom. I grew up in Fujinomiya, Japan. My mom was American and dad was Japanese. It's a really nice place to live and grow up in. We also get a lot of tourism thanks to Sengen Shrine and Mount Fuji. Now, on to my story. My first job was working night shift at a konbini, or convenience store. From there on, my sleep cycle was ruined. I worked night shift there for so long it became typical of me to work night shift jobs. I tried a couple of times to adjust to a normal day-night cycle, but it seemed impossible for me. But this story is about my experience working at that convenience store. Working nights at a konbini can be lonely. Most of my time was spent alone there. My manager didn't like to work nights, and he trusted me in the store alone. I figured it was a good idea to be on his good side and not complain about it. Maybe one day he would trust me to be a manager. As you would expect, working nights can be really slow. In fact, the average night was really slow. And when things are really slow, you end up finding things to do for yourself. I spent a lot of time daydreaming. I did have a bit of a fear of being robbed, and I often wondered how I would react if someone came in and tried to rob the place. I would hope that I would react calmly and just give them the money or whatever they wanted so they would leave. Obviously, my fears back then were realistic, right? I never even once wondered if the place was haunted or possessed. But these fears of being robbed never became more than daydreams, because it just never happened. The people that came through that place at night fit into one of three categories. There were the career folk coming home late that needed a quick snack or pick-me-up. There were the hikikomori, which I think most closely translates to shut-in, young people who despise other people or hate society. They try to stay inside all day. But I would see them come out at night when everyone else was in bed, coming in for some udon or ramen. And thirdly, there would be groups of teenagers, delinquents that should probably be in bed at the time, but would rather make a bit too much noise in the store than leave without buying anything. Basically, none of these three groups fit the mold for criminals, so it wasn't real people that I had to worry about. After a time, I felt comfortable working the nights, until it started. One night, it was especially slow and quiet. It was winter, colder than usual. People were staying home enjoying a good night's rest, or tea, or video games, all of which sounded heavenly to me. A couple of hours had passed, and not a single customer had come in. After washing the same counter space 3 times over, then double-checking the shelves to make sure everything was stocked, I ran out of things to do and I was very bored. I could not afford a cell phone at the time, so to pass the time I started reading a shonen magazine. You can mock me all you want, but I was really into One Piece at the time. It's kinda crazy how that series is still going on after so long. Anyway, I was flipping through the pages for another 15 minutes or so. Then the sliding door to the store opened. Instinctively, I looked up. I saw an extremely attractive woman. She had just walked in. She had straight, dark hair, pale skin, and light pink lips. She was maybe 160 centimeters tall. I think that's about 5'3". She seemed quite shy. When she entered the store, she kind of half grinned in my direction with a quick glance. Then she walked to the back of the store, toward the beverages. Seeing such a cute girl, I got kind of nervous. I was 17 years old at the time, and I'd never had a girlfriend, let alone touched a girl. I tried to keep my cool and figured the best thing to do would be to distract myself until she came up to purchase something. So I picked the magazine back up and continued to read it. All the while, I couldn't actually take in what I was reading, as I knew she would be approaching the register soon. Then the sliding door opened again. I thought immediately, wow, 2 customers within a minute of each other after such a slow night. That was unusual, but maybe they knew each other. I looked up, and my eyes went wide. Entering the store was the same girl. She gave the same quick glance and the same half smile in my direction. The only difference was a slight gray color under her eyes. She then also walked toward the back of the store as well, where I saw that the original girl was gone. I scanned the entire room, but no one else was there. I started to rub my eyes, thinking that maybe I just didn't see her walk out before. Maybe she had just come back in for whatever reason. A few seconds later, one of the lights toward the back of the store began to go out. I went into the back room to grab a new fluorescent bulb, and when I came back to the front of the store, the light was just fine, but that second girl was gone. I lay the unopened box with the light against the counter away from my walking path. I'd probably need it later in the night if that light was going to go out. A few moments after that, the door opened again. I couldn't breathe when I looked, and there she was once more. The exact same girl, the exact same glance given to me, with the exact same half smile. The bags around her eyes were darker now. Her lips appeared cracked and irritated. Even her hair appeared more greasy and unkempt. She turned and began to walk to the back of the store again. I walked away from the register and past the door. I was worried for my own sake and for hers. Something was wrong with this girl, and she might need some help. I began to stutter out an "Excuse me, miss," when I realized the moment I spoke at all was a huge mistake. The girl stopped, her back turned toward me. I stayed quiet. Then the lights in the room all went out at once, for a little under a second. When they came back on, the girl in front of me was completely gone. I was dumbfounded. This had took a turn into the uncanny, the not normal. But then the sliding door opened from behind me. I was terrified, too scared to turn and look to see who was there. I could hear someone breathing. The sliding door opened again, then closed, then opened, then closed, several more times just like that, before finally stopping. I could hear a dozen different sources of breathing behind me now, a dozen different people behind me breathing slowly, deeply, in a quiet store. I swallowed and gathered my courage. Then, when I was ready, I turned in an instant. Now facing the entrance, I saw that there was no one else there. I remained the only person in the store. That was the end of the strange things for that night, but something else did happen a few nights after. I was sweeping the floors that night. It was close to the time the morning guy would be coming in with the manager. It was still fully dark out, but I'd seen a few people walking past to get to their jobs. Usually a couple of people would walk in for some quick breakfast or an energy drink. But the store was empty once again, and I was finishing up my duty to sweep. I was backing up with my finished mound of debris, which consisted of grass and dust and such. I was bringing the pile to the front of the store carefully, as it would be much easier to pick up there. That's when I bumped into someone. Now, no one had come in for a while. I would have heard them walk in if they had, and I had been alone for the last 45 minutes for sure. It was weird, but I didn't realize it. Instead, I was on autopilot. I quickly turned to give a quick bow and to apologize to the person I bumped into. But when I turned around, I was met with the face of the girl from that night, and she was looking worse than ever. Her eyes were bloodshot, hair was a mess and no longer straight. There were cuts all over her cheeks going downward, and I noticed that her fingernails were broken and bloodied. It looked as if she had been scraping her own face with her nails. Her dried lips were now cracked and bleeding in places. I couldn't speak. She was looking down at the floor as I stood there motionless and horrified. I prayed that she didn't bring those eyes up to look at me. She didn't, but instead she whispered something. "Sumimasen." Then the lights flickered like before, and she was gone in an instant. If you don't know, sumimasen means excuse me, or pardon me. If I wasn't sure before that something wicked was going on with this place, I was sure then. Then things died down for an entire year. It was winter again, and I'd taken a job offer for a just-out-of-town factory that would pay me far more for my time. It would be a train ride away, sure, but I'd be in a far better situation. I'd given my notice to the manager, so I was on my last month of work at the convenience store. I was more nervous than excited. Honestly, I'm not the type of person that handles change well, and this was going to be quite a big change for me. It was the best move, I think. The store was seeing less and less business over the past year. We had some competitors rising up around the city, and staying afloat was more than difficult for us. That translated to less business for us overall. My boring nights became even more dull. Those experiences I'd had the year prior had become nothing more than a ghost story I shared with my family and a few close friends I had. They readily believed my story, too. The locals where I grew up often took a discussion of ghosts, legends, and myths quite seriously. My parents simply reminded me that if there is a ghost in the store, respect it and don't let it be the reason I quit my job. Well, I was working one new moon night. It was so dark out you couldn't see outside the entryway door, except for a spot from the distant lone street lamp. I was stocking bottles and jugs of tea from the back room, sliding those items into the coolers. When I was alone in the store and I had to work from the back room, I would usually do it quickly, so as to get back to the front to monitor the store in case someone walked in. But restocking the coolers meant I could slow down. You see, I had a good view of the store through the shelves, so I was just taking my time. As I approached the bottom rows of the coolers, I had to crouch down, and in that stance my legs grew tired quickly. So at one point, while grabbing another bottle and reaching into the cooler, I tried to situate myself into a more comfortable position. Just for a moment, I was looking away from the cooler, when suddenly, the bottle fell onto its side in the cooler, no longer in my hand, because my knuckles had collided with something inside, something colder than the cooler itself, moist and soft. The moment I looked up, my heart began to beat so hard, it felt like my ribcage was going to burst. I wanted to yank my hand away, but I was too scared of what would happen. Instead, I left my hand where it was, and I stared back. Because what my fist had collided with was the back of someone's throat. Someone with absolutely no body heat at all. And I did recognize that face, the face of the person whose mouth I had intruded into. It was the girl from last year, that phantom girl who had appeared and disappeared repeatedly and terrified me for so long. She was sprawled on the floor with her face shoved into the cooler from the other side, mouth unhinged in an inhuman way, so that my hand could fit inside her mouth with ease. I could not move. I couldn't think. But I finally managed to react to this entity at long last. I screamed. I screamed so loud that even she was affected by it. She winced and crawled backward, fading out of existence rather than instantly, compared to before. Gaining control of my body again, I began to kick at the cooler, pulling myself backward until I hit the back wall of the store. There I lay, staring through the second-to-last half-empty shelf in the cooler, waiting for something to move on the other side, waiting to see that demon of a girl crawling across the floor between the aisles in the front of the store. Truthfully, I stayed like that for about an hour. Thankfully, no customers entered the store during that period, while I was trying my best to regain my sanity. When I finally felt sane enough to lift myself from the floor and walk back to the front of the store, I did so shaking from head to toe. I peered around the corner first, checking everything within view. No one. It was clear. Then I ran for the phone on the counter and swallowed deep. I dialed my manager's number, who would be coming to work in a few hours, so I was sure he'd be angry and half asleep. After he answered, and I apologized repeatedly about a dozen times, I made my request. I could not wait another 2 hours for the morning crew to arrive, so I asked that someone relieve me immediately. I wasn't really able to say more than I was scared for my own safety, which was just enough to get him to cooperate. In about 10 minutes, an extra tired crew member took my place. I bowed and apologized, then left for home as quickly as I could. The walk home was dark and terrifying. I found myself checking every street that I walked past. When I actually did see the silhouette of another person, I nearly yelped, as my mind was inserting the face of that girl on them. But I quickly realized I was just crazy, just scared. When I made it home, I spent the remainder of the morning with my parents, before they had to leave for work. They found my sudden need to be around them a bit irritating, but I was so scared of being alone at the time that I couldn't help it. When they left me alone, I kept every light in our apartment on. I washed my hands, then took a long hot bath. After all that, I still felt violated, dirty, fearing for my own life. But nothing else happened. The next month passed by slowly, and I transitioned into my new job, now excited rather than nervous. To this day, I never did find out who that girl was, let alone what she was. I never asked if a girl had died at that store. I was aware of the superstitious beliefs of the people around me, but before this, I never took it to heart. Never once did I think that I had experienced something like this myself. But I have a whole new fear for the paranormal. And to think after that second experience, where I heard her say, "Excuse me," I thought she was a nice spirit. But after nearly having my arm devoured by her, I don't think her intentions were quite kind. Warning. The following story contains disturbing scenes concerning animals and pets. If this is outside your comfort zone, click away. I used to go jogging in front of my house. You could say I was just uncomfortable running too far from home. You see, I preferred to run around dark, but we lived in the pseudo-suburbs, and we didn't have a streetlight anywhere close. And by pseudo-suburb, I mean miles of rolling hills and forest on the tail end of interspersed houses. Past our house, there ain't nothing for miles. Nothing but trees, that is. You can call me cowardly. You could even call me superstitious or afraid of the dark. But I wasn't about to stray too far from the lights of our front porch at night. So the 20 meters from our mailbox to the cable box on the side of the road became my track. Back and forth. Run a few minutes, walk several, repeat. This kept me in shape, feeling good, and gave me a chance to catch up with all my podcasts that I listened to, thanks to the wireless earbuds my wife had gotten me for my birthday. These earbuds even had sound pass-through. It wasn't perfect, but I could hear a muffled version of the sounds around me, even while listening to my music or podcasts. It was good stuff, but all of this added to the horrific reason I don't go jogging anymore. It started last year when winter was beginning to give way to spring. The ground was constantly wet, caking the bottoms of my joggers with mud as I bounded, out of breath, up and down the unpaved road. I was getting winded sooner than usual that night, probably due to eating too much at dinner earlier. This meant I should probably do a few more back and forths, then call it a night. As I approached the cable box again and began to turn on my heel to walk back to the mailbox, I caught a distinct sound through my earbud pass-through that I nearly shrugged off as the peripherals causing distortion or warping some mundane noise around me into this eerie resonance. I paused. It was already troubling enough to turn my back on the dark, meandering road beyond, but this sound immediately increased my heart rate, even though I had no idea what it was or where it was coming from. Convincing myself that it was just some sort of breakage from the hit-or-miss pass-through, I stepped forward, but then I paused once more. The sound came again, a low rumbling enveloped in static. At this, I pulled the earbuds from my head and scanned my surroundings. I couldn't see much. Human eyes are terrible for seeing in the dark, and the nearby porch light kept them from adapting completely to the blackness around me. But my ears heard it clearly. The static within the noise was gone now that my earbuds weren't in. It was a low, rumbling sound, an odd frequency that made my ribs vibrate with it. I had turned around completely then, now facing the dark, winding road past the cable box. But looking along the road was my mistake, as the noise was coming from the trees. Coming from above me, actually. My eyes scoured the branches to the left and to the right, some hanging over the road, others daring not reach too far. When I found myself staring into two congruent stars in the cloudy night sky, I knew that I was not alone. Those weren't stars, they were eyes. Sitting upon a short, thick branch of an ancient oak tree was a figure which itself reminded me of trees and branches, sharp, angular bits protruding from it. It was nothing more than a silhouette and eyes from my perspective, though, but I could hear the rumbling coming from it, and I could see the twinkle of its eyes fade in and out as it blinked. It was something alive, something large, something bizarrely shaped. I backed away, carefully guiding myself back to the driveway without looking away from the entity. But halfway back, the rumbling stopped, and the starlight eyes looked away at last. Had I intruded on its space? I'd walked this road 100 times before, but had never witnessed such a thing. This was my space, my territory. Yet there I stood, trembling and still walking backward in my own driveway, terrified and baffled. Back inside, I peeled the sweaty shirt from myself and quickly shared the experience with my wife.
"How big was it?"
was her first question.
"Well, I didn't have the greatest view of the thing," I admitted. "But it reminded me of a crouched man, if they were wearing a ghillie suit."
She thought for a moment.
"Probably a possum. Maybe it looked weird because its silhouette overlapped some branches and foliage. Made it look bigger."
She'd always been a voice of reason, and though I didn't like the idea of her just disbelieving me before anything else, I did find comfort in the idea that what I saw was completely natural, explainable, or benign. The following morning, as I had the day off, I went for a morning jog. I would be running up that meandering road thanks to the bravery afforded me by daylight. But before I took off, I wanted to investigate the spot where I'd seen that supposed possum. It wasn't hard to find, though. There was, under the branch I'd seen it, a great red splatter, and tufts of matted gray-brown fur. Judging from the remains I'd found in the leaves nearby, it appeared to be someone's dog, perhaps a German or Dutch shepherd. I ran back inside the house. My wife was at work at the time, but she had a DSLR camera with a lens that had some amazing optical zoom. After finding it, I ran back outside, careful not to step in that mess. I peered through the camera up at the branch where that thing had been sitting. I swallowed hard. There were red stains on the bark, as well as deep holes gouged into the branch. Even if a possum could devour a German shepherd, I was sure that they didn't have talons so big and they could stab deep eyeball-sized holes into wood. After taking some pictures to show my wife, I placed the camera back inside and went the opposite direction for my morning run. I didn't like jogging where my neighbors were, but at least it felt safer. When I had told my wife and showed her the pictures, she then believed it was some kind of mountain lion, which I was then convinced of too. A couple of nights later, I felt courageous enough for another just after sundown jog. Back and forth I went again, getting my heart rate up in a jiffy as I felt in a good mood to run. My earbuds were in, the air was almost warm, and the ground was dry. It was nearly a perfect night for it. As I was listening to a new podcast I'd discovered, an episodic serial killer series of all things, I suddenly felt my chest vibrating. The tickling sensation immediately sent me into a panic. I only realized then that my pass-through was turned off. I then remembered that I reset the earbud application recently, causing my settings to reset as well. I stopped in my tracks and yanked out the earbuds. I looked instinctively to that branch, but I did not see eyes or a silhouette this time. Nothing out of place over there. When my chest vibrated again, I now heard the sound that caused it. Instead of a rumbling, it sounded like a low growl, a dog's growl. Searching the forest floor around the road, I soon saw eyeshine. It was in fact a dog, a German shepherd, and immediately I wanted to vomit. It was peering from around a nearby tree. Its eyes were completely motionless, lifeless, never blinking. And worst of all, its jaw seemed far too slack and open, sickeningly loose as if it was broken or lodged out of place. Even still, it seemed to shift or pulsate as it growled intermittently. I didn't want to believe what I was looking at. It looked exactly like some sick freak was using a dog's head to taunt me from behind that tree. But the sound that was coming from there, it wasn't human, not even close, and I could vaguely make out sharp claws holding on to the bottom of the poor dog's skull. It wasn't human, and it wasn't taunting me either. It was luring me. It wanted me in those woods, and all I wanted was to stay inside for the rest of my life. I didn't hesitate. I took off back to my house in a full sprint. The moment I looked back during my run, that one moment when I couldn't help but want to know if I was being chased then, a blunt pain shot over my face as a sickening wet slap reverberated around me. I wiped the fluid from my watering eyes and held my nose as it felt broken. Then I nearly tripped. The dog's head was below me. That creature had thrown a dog's severed head at me. As I stood there, stunned and injured, I nearly didn't hear the rapid quadrupedal footsteps racing towards me from behind, as well as deep, raspy panting that caused my ribs to vibrate. I tried to scream as I carried myself up the slight hill to my front door, and the moment I shut that door, a violent clawing could be heard from just outside. The rumbling erupted again, too, causing my chest to vibrate more violently than ever. It no longer tickled or felt strange. It hurt, causing me to scream. My wife watched in shock, too scared to ask any questions. After the sounds died down, I sat on the couch for the remainder of the night, holding my wife close after she helped me with my broken nose. After this incident, my wife and I are looking into moving, quite seriously. This was our first home purchase, a place I thought we'd grow old in. I can't tell you how awful this feeling is, being driven from your home by something you can't explain, being so horrified and dominated by something outside of your control and understanding, something no one else believes. I don't know if there's more than one of them, but if you see the signs, stay indoors at night. When dogs go missing or are killed in your neighborhood, when you see the starry eyes in the trees, when there are deep gouges in the tree branches, move. Growing up, my family was extremely poor. We lived in the south, in the middle of the countryside. It was land mostly owned by my mom's parents. They allowed my dad to do with the land as he pleased, which amounted to him hunting and farming on the land. This was basically a necessity. We were so poor that even though my dad had a full-time job, he'd have to come home and farm and hunt to feed us. He grew tomatoes, cucumbers, and zucchini and other things, and would bring back deer meat and squirrel meat most of the time from his hunts. Even though I was a kid, I knew I couldn't be picky. My most notable memories of dinners we had included fried tomatoes and zucchini, as well as deer steak and squirrel dumplings. I loved it. Then again, I didn't try much else for a long time. It was just whatever we could grow and eat, with an extremely rare outing into town. But food from town tasted weird to me. Anyway, when Dad did come home and did have free time, he was tired, exhausted. And with him and Mom always busy or just tired, they didn't really have time to supervise me. When I was 4, they were beginning to realize that I needed to be able to play outside, but they couldn't supervise me constantly. Dad knew the troubles about that land. There were coyotes, bobcats, mountain lions, even bears. He'd seen them for himself. So they discussed a solution to this problem together. They ended up finding me and adopting me a puppy. The puppy was so playful and perky, with tons of energy and love to give. She had blue eyes, too. That was curious for me. I'd seen dogs before, and I'd never seen one with eyes like that. So blue, they were like the blue of a flame. Mom decided to name her Sapphire. She had to explain to me what a sapphire even was first. We ended up calling her Saffy most of the time. Saffy and I grew up together. She grew into a big, pretty dog. We never did figure out her breed, though, but I'll try to describe her looks. She looked like a mix between a German and Australian Shepherd. Her ears were narrow and pointed, and her coat was light gray with splashes of black thrown in. Her snout was long and angular, and she was quite tall. My dad was 6 foot in his prime, and she came up to his waist on all fours. She was just as loyal and protective my parents had hoped she would be. She would join my dad on hunts sometimes. She got pretty darn good at running deer across his hunting trail. Plus, she scared the crap out of the local coyote population. My dad says for as long as she was full grown, he didn't see hide nor hair of coyotes or bobcats anymore. Plus, she was my best friend. Safi loved to play fetch. I had this old plastic frisbee that I got in some sort of goodie bag when I visited some church one Easter. We never went back, but it was worth it, because that lime green frisbee, that was Safi's favorite toy. Safi slept in the house at night. She may have been big and sturdy, but no member of the family was just going to be left outside every night. So she would usually sleep in a little pile of pillows in my bedroom, or she would sleep on this handmade chest my mom had. It sat under the living room window and gave Safi a good look outside when she wanted it. When I turned 10 years old, something happened that changed my family forever. Late one night, Safi began to bark. Now, our Safi knew better than to wake up the whole house to a storm of barking in the middle of the night. This was something she hadn't done for years because we trained her out of it. She hadn't done something like that since she was a very small puppy. Mom and Dad somehow slept through this, but that may be because they're heavy sleepers, and I woke up quickly to make her stop. You see, I didn't want poor Safi to get in trouble, so I went to investigate myself. I got her to calm down real quick. Her barking turned into low whimpers instead. She seemed desperate to get to something outside. She was staring out the window, glancing back at me every few seconds. It was as if she was trying to get me to see it too. I peered out the window and scanned left and right and up and down, but I didn't see a thing. Nothing out of the ordinary and no movement. I was a 10-year-old child, though, and I had completely convinced myself that Safi and I should go outside and investigate this together. She'd always stuck by my side before. She didn't like to stray too far from you when you walked outside. I threw on a big warm jacket and my dad's boots that he left by the door. They were way too big for me. I then began to open the door, but as soon as there was enough room, Safi burst outside and ran off into the woods, still whimpering instead of barking all the way, until I could not hear her anymore. I ran after her, calling her name over and over again. I couldn't catch up to her, and I soon realized that I had no idea what direction she could have gone in those woods. I searched all over the forest, following our trails, trying to find a trace of her until sunrise. By the time my parents were up, they found my bedroom without their son in it, so they opened the door to look for me. But there I was, crying on the porch. I let them know what happened, told them that I was the reason Safi had run away. Dad placed his hand on my shoulder, trying to comfort me as best he could. He told me we'd go look for her together in the truck, and we did just that. Dad called in sick first, even though honestly he couldn't afford a sick day like that. Mom stayed at the house in case she came back. Me and Dad drove around, driving real slow through the trails in those woods, calling out her name. We parked in several spots, walking through the woods and calling out for her, searching for Safi up and down and all over. After a long and unsuccessful day, we had to call it quits for the time being. But Dad was sure to remind me that Safi was a good girl. She was probably just lost, he said. He told me them dogs got a knack for finding their way back home. And I believed him. I'd always seen my parents as people who were smarter than me. Sure enough, Dad was right. The following day, right before sundown, we saw Safi walking right out of those woods. Immediately, I was worried she was hurt. She wasn't panting like you'd expect a tired and hungry dog to be doing, but she was walking real slow and a bit awkward. She was walking like she saw us as strangers all of a sudden, but she knew that she had to approach us anyway. I was kind of cautious about getting up close to her at first. It was the strangest feeling. When I did get close, I couldn't help but hug her and pet her like crazy. Immediately, I noticed something else that was odd. Safi was perfectly clean. This dog had been lost in the woods for 2 days. She didn't look a bit dirty, let alone hungry or thirsty. My parents were happy to see her back at first, too, but even that wouldn't last long. Whatever came back from those woods, I don't think it was the same Safi. I used to feed Safi myself every morning. It was my chore, even though it never felt like one. We fed her this canned dog food that she was crazy about. Plus, we were never allowed to feed her table scraps. We wanted to keep her happy and healthy. But when we tried to feed her after her return, she would not take the food. She seemed insanely uninterested with it. She wouldn't drink out of her water bowl either. So we tried to force some food on her tongue to remind her of the taste and to stoke her appetite. But she ended up biting my dad. She even drew blood. My dad was definitely the most taken off guard about it. He wasn't mad though. He apologized to the girl and pet her before going to bandage up his finger. It was decided then that she would eat when she was ready. Worst comes to worst, we'd have to find some money to take her to the vet if she got sick. A week passed by. We hadn't seen her eat or drink yet. In fact, her water bowl had not been refilled at all. There was the same amount of water in there as the first day she came back. She hadn't touched it. Despite this, Safi stayed the same shape, the same weight. Dad had convinced himself that something more ordinary was going on. He claimed that when she was lost in the woods, she discovered her joy of hunting. It is only natural for a dog. So now she enjoyed meals outdoors whenever she was outside. We didn't see her eat or drink because maybe she enjoyed finding that stuff for herself. But I didn't quite believe that. I went with it, but I didn't agree. I'd missed her so much and I'd blamed myself so deeply for nearly losing her. I just wanted things to be normal. But they only got worse. Safi stopped sleeping in my room when she came back. She would do her sleeping in the living room from there on, apparently. But one night, I woke up and I found that Safi was on top of me. I was about to smile and pet her until I really saw what was going on. Safi was on top of me crouching, and her teeth were fully bared, inches from my face. She wasn't growling or snarling though, nothing like that. What she was doing was sort of vibrating, rapidly shaking back and forth unnaturally. There was a sound coming from her mouth too. Christ, just remembering that sound gives me chills. It was like an old woman who'd been smoking her whole life, screaming desperately for help from the middle of some deep cave. It was all one long breath of a sound. No interruptions, no stops, just one long, awful, horrifying noise coming from that dog. I kid you not, this went on for about 2 minutes straight. Then my mom groggily opened the door to my bedroom the rest of the way, as it was a bit ajar. She wanted to know what that noise was. Instantly, Safi stopped making that noise. She stopped shaking too, then jumped down off my bed and walked that slow, awkward walk back to the living room. I explained to my parents that I did not feel safe with Safi anymore. that she wasn't the same dog. When I admitted this, I knew that they agreed with me, but they didn't say it. I don't think they wanted to believe it. They didn't want to admit that the dog we'd raised and put so much love and time and money into was broken, was all wrong. From then on, I locked my bedroom door at night. I even began avoiding Safi throughout the day. Eventually, something happened that broke me right out of my denial. It was then that it became clear to me that this was not the same animal that I'd loved before. She didn't even like to play with her frisbee. I remember trying to throw that frisbee with her, and she wouldn't even look at it. She would just stare at me. That was really heartbreaking. Anyway, one day, Safi had been in and out of the house all day, doing God knows what, while Dad was out hunting once again. As for me, I was minding my own business. I was pretty bored, so I decided to go for a walk on the trails in the woods. But I didn't expect to run into Safi. I did. I saw her there in the woods, but she didn't see me for a while. She had somehow managed to get herself halfway up a tree. I didn't know dogs could climb trees like that. She was lying down with ease on a thin tree branch. I didn't call out to her. I used to be excited when I saw Safi, but nowadays when I saw her, I'd rather just turn and walk away. But then I saw her mouth. It was wide open, but completely motionless. Her mouth was covered in red. It appeared to be blood. And then I really saw the branches around her. They were covered in carcasses, dead birds, dead squirrels, a couple of dead snakes too. Apparently none of them had been eaten either. They'd simply been killed and strewn about on the tree. It was like the tree was decorated with animal corpses. Seeing this, I was stunned and disturbed. And then I looked at Safi again. She still hadn't moved, and she appeared to not be breathing at all. She was lying there, her head up, mouth still wide open. It was similar to how she was lying on my bed that night. But this time, her mouth was so open, so damn wide, it looked as if she was about to tear the skin and bones from her own face. She didn't budge at all either. No sound was coming out of her. I couldn't look away from this. I watched her for several minutes, trying to control my breathing because I did not want her to hear me. I waited for her to move, waited for her to take a big breath or yawn or get her attention taken by something moving in the woods, but it never happened. For the entirety of those several disturbing minutes, she remained in this state. Then, my mom called me from the house behind me in the distance. I turned only for a moment, awakened from my stupor. When I turned back towards Safi, she was no longer in the tree. I found her on the ground right in front of me, staring up at me. I was so badly startled that I fell backward onto the ground. She looked at me for a moment, then walked away in the opposite direction of the house. It was then that I realized that her eyes had changed too. They weren't that sapphire blue that we'd fallen in love with. I realized that they had been fading every day since she came back. They were now a sort of blue-gray. That was the last I ever saw Safi, because after that, she never came back. Or should I say that the thing that looked like Safi never came back. This time with Safi being gone, my family didn't talk about it, didn't worry about it. We basically pretended that Safi had never come back the first time. I wasn't able to mourn for a long time either. I was too bewildered, scared, confused. Eventually, I would cry for my dog, for the real Safi that I knew way back then, But it took me years. Years of convincing myself that those couple of weeks that Safi had come back, they were just a dream, a nightmare of sorts. But it can't be. You see, I talked to my dad about this whole thing recently. It's been 18 years. I'm 28 now, and I visited my dad recently to go hunting with him, which we do often nowadays. I asked him, "Dad, do you remember Safi a long time ago? Remember when she came back home from being lost in the woods?" He looked down at the ground. We were sitting in the forest, moments away from heading back home after an unsuccessful hunt. He sort of fidgeted with the rocks in the ground a bit before answering me. Then he replied, "Well, about that, there's something I've been meaning to tell you and your mom. I just don't know how to say it. I wanted to talk about it before, when you moved out, but I couldn't. You see, son, I would see Safi in the woods for the next couple of years from time to time. She'd be staring at me from the distance, never coming too close, and I would never call out to her. She kinda creeped me out, to be honest. But the thing is, around that same time, I found a couple of trees, all messed up in the same way." I interrupted for a moment. "What do you mean, messed up?" He explained. "Well, a couple of times when I went hunting, I stumbled upon these trees. Trees covered with dead animals and such. Like someone had killed them and just tossed them there. Left them in one piece. You'd think they'd be eaten by something if they were left dead like that in the woods. But they weren't. They were just throwing on a bunch of tree branches, like some sort of bloody Christmas tree or something." My breath caught in my throat for a moment. My dad was sitting here telling me that he saw the exact same thing that I did. Telling me that this tree corpse thing had happened multiple times, and that Safi thing was still out there. He went on, "That's not even the only thing from that time. Once Safi got gone again, I started hearing weird noises on the hunts. I'm used to the animal calls out there, but this call I kept hearing was unlike anything I'd heard before. If I could compare it to something, it was like a metal cat yowling really loud from within a deep valley, all echoey and metallic and scratchy." After talking with my dad, I now know how real everything was. I can't just chalk it up to a dream now. It may have been a long time ago, but I know it all to be true. Whatever happened to my Safi, the real Sapphire, my best friend in the world, I just hope her last moments were peaceful and that she rests in peace now. I miss you, girl.